Nina was a pirate who had risen up the ranks. Often, she might be easily irritated, but she was very experienced at handling matters. She was a rather reliable person. After some thought, she gave a description in a serious manner. The well's mouth is at a rather deep depth along the seabed. I need enough time to adjust myself before I can acclimatize to the temperature and pressure of the area. That's why I took so much time to get there. It isn't easily discovered, but the remnant iron buildings are indeed rather obvious. I found them once I got acclimatized. They've already completely collapsed or rotted. There's no way to imagine what they originally looked like. However, I could tell that they definitely spanned across a great distance in the past. It's just shrunken by a great deal now. When Nina said this, she chuckled and scanned all the men around her. A real female pirate is indeed different. Klein sighed from the bottom of his heart. From his point of view, be it Admiral of Stars Catalya, Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina, or Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy, none of them could be considered a pure female pirate. All of them hailed from major factions or secret organizations. When they were low-sequence beyonders, they were either not at sea, or they were following important figures, so what they did were relatively safe matters. Otherwise, they were independent adventurers who had never been tainted by the characters and atmosphere of low or mid-level pirates. After Nina finished laughing, Catalya pointed her finger to the rusted item that could hardly be described as a metal beam. This is a portion of the iron building? Yes, Captain. As you know, I don't know much about history or mysticism. I could only bring some back for your inspection. You're an expert on this. Nina smiled as she handed the metal beam over. Then, she pointed at the black piece of hardened mud which was filled with holes on its surface. Not far from the iron ruins, I found a well. It's not very big. If it's to be described with the word huge, then I've definitely seen plenty of huge cannons. Those drunken adventurers are better at bragging than us pirates. This is the mud from the inner layer of the well. I can't imagine how such patterns could be formed. Nina's finger repeatedly struck the honeycomb dots on the black mud. Klein originally believed that they were marks left behind by dense shots with very tiny projectiles, but after a careful inspection, he suspected that they were remnant patterns, after something had rotted. Each spot was very shallow as its edges spread outwards in an irregular pattern. Nina handed the black mud to Catalya as she continued describing, the well's mouth is really small. Even a child from Nas wouldn't be able to enter. It's very deep. I even felt that it was bottomless. In that environment, the interior was completely dark as though something was slowly summoning me. Yes, slowly. I found a few rocks nearby and threw them in, but there wasn't any response. In short, it's filled with water. Catalya held up the metallic beam and black mud. Through the thick glasses, she observed them seriously. Since the mouth is very small and humans can't enter them, there's no need for us to begin the exploration immediately. It will be very dangerous. Let's wait until I figure out the secrets hidden within these items and whether the ancient well is worth us taking the risk before we return to make an attempt. Aye aye, Captain. The wet Nina was trembling as a result of the cold winds. The way she wavered made all the surrounding pirates stare straight at her. Catalya nudged her glasses and said to Nina, you can drink a bottle of Sonia bloodwine. There's no limit for the rest. Long live the captain. Nina cried out in joy. An underwater well that humans can't enter. Klein, who had no desire to explore it, summarized Nina's description. Suddenly, he had a strange idea. Humans are unable to enter the well, but that doesn't mean that non-humans can't do it. Many deep-sea fishes aren't necessarily that huge. There's a significant chance that they can pass through the well. As the sea god, he had the means to make marine creatures do his bidding while wielding the scepter. There's no rush. Let's see if Ma'am Hermit is able to figure out anything from these two objects. I'll consider whether I'll explore it on the return trip. Otherwise, I might attract some exaggerated danger. There's still not enough information regarding this. There's no way to do any divination. As his thoughts wandered, Klein's expression remained deadpan. At that moment, Catalya shot him a glance out of curiosity. Then, she retracted her gaze without leaving any traces. Why did she suddenly look at me? She was seeing what I was doing? It's impossible for her to know that I possess the sea god scepter and can make marine creatures do my bidding. That's not right. She knows, but she only knows that Mr. Fool wields Kalvatua's godhood scepter, not the world. Unless she has figured out that the world is the fool. But that's even more impossible. Even Mr. Hanged Man is still stuck at the concept that the world is a blessed. She hasn't even realized this point. Viewing this from a different point of view, I'll consider it from Admiral of Stars's angle. She's someone being pursued by knowledge, and she's a follower of Queen Mystic. She's loyal to the Moses ascetic order, and she has roamed the sea for years. She has plenty of knowledge and experience, so it wouldn't be odd that she knows that the sea god domain possesses the Beyonder power to control marine creatures. Therefore, after realizing that humans are unable to pass through the ancient well, she naturally made the connection with the scepter in Mr. Fool's hand. Does she plan on requesting for help in the future? She looked at me to figure out if the world has also grasped the corresponding information or have similar ideas. Many ideas went through Klein's mind. With the powers of Clown, he forcefully maintained his indifferent expression. He didn't react abnormally in any way. As Nina was about to draw the Sonia bloodwine, Klein pressed down his hat and returned to the cabin. Just as he was about to approach the door, a figure surfaced in his mind suddenly. In a room in the cabin's upper level, the windows were tightly shut and the curtains were drawn. There were a pair of blurry eyes hidden behind them, silently watching the crowd on the deck, as well as Gehrman Sparrow. Who is it? Klein didn't stop. His body didn't show any hesitation as he entered the cabin normally as though nothing had happened. At 3 in the afternoon, the bright but not scorching sunlight shone into the garden adjacent to Stowen University. Michel Duth was already a senior associate professor by 40. He was wearing a long tailcoat and a beautiful bow tie as he waited by the door. Yesterday evening, he received a letter. The sender was from the attendant of the richest aristocratic family in Eastchester County, the Hall family. The person who wrote the letter was the daughter of a member of Parliament from the House of Lords who wielded immense influence. She was Miss Audrey Hall, who was deemed to be the most stunning gem in Backland. This noble lady had mentioned in the letter that she had learned from a gathering that Mr. Michel Duth was an outstanding collector and an aficionado of this domain. She had a great desire in paying a visit. Michel Duth didn't have any reason to refuse. Soon, a classic carriage with a family emblem arrived at the door. 2 servants, who had been instructed to open the outer gates made of iron railings, led the carriage around the garden and arrived in front of the house. A housekeeper was the first to alight, followed by guards and maidservants. Following that, a hand wearing a long white gauzed glove was extended outside. With the help of the maidservants, Audrey elegantly stepped onto the carpet which Michel had paved. Michel was first taken aback before his eyes lit up. He felt as though the flowers in the garden had instantly faded. He took 2 steps forward and took off his hat to bow. Welcome, my honorable lady. Your visit is an honor for me and my family. Audrey took off the veiled hat and passed it to her maidservant before exchanging a few pleasantries. Then, she followed Michel Duth into the living room and entered the collector's room on the first floor. Here, Michel finally found his confidence as the master of the house. He began pointing at his collection and providing an introduction from the left. This is a helmet that appeared in the White Rose War. After lots of research, it can be determined that the owner is a member of the Sauron family. Back then, they were still considered royalty. The golden helmet had an intricate design. There were avian and flying wings that adorned it, and the visor was formed from pieces of golden scales. My ancestor obtained his first aristocratic title in that war, Audrey replied with piqued interest. She had already adjusted her mental state ahead of time. She was to appear as though she was really here to tour the collections. The failure of the 20-year war had caused the kingdom to suffer years of humiliation, but it also carved out several heroes. Michel resorted to flattery. The White Rose War happened after the 20-year war and before the Battle of the Violated Oath. There, Lowen defeated Intis and became strong again. Michel continued introducing his collection as Audrey solemnly listened, raising questions from time to time as she conversed with him. Finally, Michel's finger pointed towards a notebook with a black cover. This belonged to a knight stationed on Sonia Island in the 20-year war. This knight's name has already vanished in the long rivers of history. This notebook is the only proof of his existence. He once stood fast until the very last moment on Sonia Island. This notebook is not only a first-hand account for the research of that portion of history, but it also hides certain problems. The knight's grammar has many uncommon habits. This might be a clue to aid us in determining his exact identity. Audrey instinctively believed that the notebook was her target. Hence, she only leaned in a little. Indeed, the black cover had unobvious patterns. Together, they outlined an abstract image of a dragon. From Michel's tone and minute expressions, his interest is focused on the content and not the item itself. He doesn't particularly treasure it. I have a high chance of purchasing it. Audrey calmly made a judgment as she turned her head. She then smiled at Michel Duth and said, "What are the uncommon habits exactly?" Enjoys using short sentences, very simple and short ones. Michelle described in a flaunting tone. Audrey was always a good listener. She looked at him with a smile as she listened with focused attention. This made Michelle speak more. As she listened, she suddenly felt that the knight's grammatical habits were somewhat familiar. That is. Audrey's eyes darted around slightly as she quickly remembered the source of the familiarity. This was a grammatical habit of Dragonese which she had diligently mastered. Nina was a pirate who had risen up the ranks. Often, she might be a knight who knows Dragonese and even used it in the critical stage of his growth. It's no wonder that the psychology alchemists wished to obtain the notebook he left behind. Audrey was enlightened as she stopped her wandering thoughts. She happily and seriously discussed the problem that stemmed from such grammatical habits with Michelle Duth. Soon, they concluded the discussion over the notebook as Michelle began introducing the other items. Time passed as the tour slowly came to an end. Audrey had planned on raising her request of purchasing the notebook to their next meeting in order to make her goal less obvious. However, in a friendly atmosphere and with the naturalness of their conversation, she sharply sensed that it was an opportunity. Hence, with the powers of lie, she made her cheeks blush red. Mr. Duth, that helmet from the Sauron royalty that originates from the White Rose War is a keepsake of my ancestors. Pardon my presumptuous, but can I buy it from you? Also, the notebook of the 20-Year War. I'm very impressed by the knight that stood firm for Sonia Island and also wish to have it. I know it's not a polite request, but I wish that you can understand how I feel. Of course, you have the right to decline. Her eyes moved as she obviously darted them around, partially deliberate and truthful to express her lack of confidence and embarrassment. Michelle subconsciously moved his gaze away as he said with a hoarse and slow voice, I'm a collector. I won't sell my collection. His tone and the words he used aren't firm enough. In the intel I previously gathered, he's a gentleman who values his reputation greatly. Using cash to purchase his collection is probably unacceptable. The reason why the psychology alchemists didn't get someone else to complete the mission is firstly because I have a way of earning contribution points, and secondly, it probably took the associate professor's attitude towards such matters in mind. I have to change my approach. Before the visit, Audrey had already carefully decided of different tests according to the intel she received. After some thought, she changed topics. Mr. Duth, I heard that you're requesting Stowen University to build an ancient relic research center? Yes, that has been my goal for the past few years. Michelle looked at Audrey and answered frankly. Audrey smiled faintly and said, I'm very interested in the research in this area. I also feel a deep respect for you and hope to see your wish fulfilled. Well, I'm planning on donating £1,000, a nearby piece of land spanning 2,000 Rs less than sup greater than 1 less than sup greater than, and a manner with rather good returns to the faculty you are from at Stowen University. I hope to have a non-profit basic relic search and preservation foundation set up. I know it's not a lot, but I will drum up support from the ladies and gentlemen I know in order to get them to make a certain amount of contributions. Mr. Duth, I think you're the most professional relic collector and researcher I know. I'm wondering if you're willing to be the person in charge of this non-profit foundation? 2,000 Rs of land near the university. That's worth about £6,000. Together with the manor and the cash, Miss Audrey would be donating nearly £10,000. With such a non-profit relic search and preservation foundation, the difficulties I would encounter to get my research grants approved would be drastically lowered. Michelle paused for a few seconds before revealing a sincere smile. He bowed solemnly and said, My honorable lady, the importance you place on academia has left me touched. Its glow is enough to match your beauty and upbringing. I believe I have no reason to reject your invitation. I've already recorded the contents of the notebook. I will send it and the helmet to your residence tonight. Treat it as a gift from a sincere friend. Success. Audrey was delighted as she wished to praise herself. However, she appeared reserved and indifferent. She didn't do anything that was improper. It's my honor, she said earnestly. Although the two items were definitely not worth £10,000, it wouldn't result in any loss on her part. In her plans, this suggestion contained 3 important goals which yielded 3 returns. The first goal was naturally to obtain the item and complete the mission. She would then successfully obtain the hypnotist potion formula from the psychology alchemists. The second goal was to enhance her prestige, standing, and image via donating to academic research and the preservation of ancient relics. This was something most nobles and tycoons needed to do. Even if the donation wasn't today, Audrey would have to donate £3,000 or more to the various charitable organizations. Therefore, she believed that her father, Earl Hall, wouldn't stop her from doing this with a few of her properties. The third goal was that by having a foundation that focused on the search and preservation of ancient relics, it made it easier for her to come into contact with historical records or mysterious items of value. Audrey didn't need to personally do anything. All she needed to do was sit at home to receive items that might be beneficial to her. It was equivalent to using £10,000 to produce even more money to establish her own faction. Of course, if Michelle Duth hadn't accepted this exchange, then she had other plans. The kingdom's Higher Education Commission had someone from the Hall family, as well as noble friends she knew. As long as the associate professor had anything he needed, she was certain that she had the means to satisfy him. However, Audrey didn't like such methods. She had a nagging feeling that it was shady and would harm the public interest. After discussing the matter, Audrey stayed for a little longer and chatted idly for about 15 minutes. It made the wrapping up process not as sharp and abrupt. Following that, she first left Michelle's house and rode her carriage back to the Hall family's villa in Stowen City. Past 8 in the evening, she received the Sauron royalty's helmet and the notebook from the 20-Year War. Audrey wore a pair of white silk gloves and sat before her desk with piqued interest. She placed the helmet to the side as she began flipping through the content in the notebook. She discovered that the records were sparse. The early records indicated how the knight who was stationed in the ancient Elvish island had learned how to brew Sonia bloodwine, how he chased after women, how he spent the boring days. In the later records, it entered the period of the 20-Year War. It mainly included his cursing of the people of Faceac, his grumbling about his companions, and the consideration towards his plans to stand fast. It also included the end of how the Sonia Island was first lost. Apart from the grammatical habits being similar to Dragonese, there aren't any serious problems. Nor can I find any hidden clues. Audrey frowned as she closed the notebook. She had used methods derived from mysticism to do her checks, but they were to no avail. This made her unwilling to waste time as she planned to turn it in to the psychology alchemists. As her thoughts raced, she suddenly had a new idea. Mr. World and Mr. Hanged Man will often consider problems from different angles to provide suggestions. Should I learn from them? Well, viewing it from a different point of view, if the content of the notebook isn't problematic, would the physical item actually be what the psychology alchemists are after? What's so special about it? I didn't discover anything. It belongs to a knight who's accustomed to using Dragonese. That knight must have experienced something. Divination. Yes, divination. Perhaps I can find the knight's final location using divination with the help of the notebook. And this might be related to a dragon. Since it's a dragon, there's a high chance that it's a mind dragon, a representative of the spectator pathway. Clues involving it would indeed be something the psychology alchemists will pay close attention to. Audrey, that's some nice thinking. Audrey's eyes turned crystal clear as it seemed to hide a clear resplendence. She couldn't help but turn her head and looked at the golden retriever sitting by the side. Susie glanced at her owner and barked. Audrey, do you want me to praise you? No, there's no need. Audrey turned her head back, feeling a little embarrassed. Then, she discovered an important question. She wasn't able to divine things herself, or it could be said that the revelation that she received from divination would be highly inaccurate. There's no way to confirm it. No, I can seek Mr. Fool's help. A secret deed ritual? It can only be performed on my body and not towards an external object. Artificial sleepwalking? It's similar to secret deed rituals, so it wouldn't do as well. Sacrifice it to Mr. Fool and get him to do the divination before bestowing it back to me? No, that won't work. It will appear rather disrespectful. He isn't my father or teacher, but a real god. Using such a method is way too casual and somewhat sacrilegious. Audrey's thoughts slowly went from Mr. Fool to divination. Although she was rather incapable of divination, she had a certain level of understanding in the corresponding knowledge. She soon locked onto a particular method of divination. It was to seek the help of a third party's strength, an unknown or mysterious existence, via a certain ritual. The most classic example of such a method was magic mirror divination. Yes, it's indeed very dangerous, but the danger stems from the possibility that the target is filled with malice or one that can cause a person to break down immediately. But I don't have such worries. I can seek Mr. Fool's help. Audrey blinked and held down her agitation as she said to the golden retriever, Susie, guard the door outside. I will use a mysticism method to study this notebook. Didn't you use them before? Susie asked, puzzled. She's getting harder to fool. Audrey's eyes darted around as she said confidently, I plan on using magic mirror divination. Don't worry. I'll make the plea to a safe existence. All right. Susie determined that Audrey was speaking the truth. She took a few steps before turning around to exhort her. Audrey, you need to be careful about being possessed by a mysterious existence. I know, Audrey replied without feeling worried at all. From her point of view, if Mr. Fool really wanted to do something to her, he had countless opportunities in the past. There was no reason for him to wait until this day. After Susie opened and closed the door by herself and went out, Audrey sat in front of her desk and recited the honorific name of the Fool to request the use of magic mirror divination. After a while, Klein, who was on the future, went to the bathroom and headed above the gray fog. There, he heard Miss Justice's prayer. That can be done? That's right. As a mysterious and unknown existence, I can be the third force in a magic mirror divination. Klein allowed it while feeling amused. Audrey immediately picked up the notebook, sat in front of the dresser, and lit a candle while facing the mirror. With the curtains drawn tightly and all the lights extinguished in the room, Audrey followed the requirements of magic mirror divination and completed the corresponding preparations. Of course, she didn't specially choose a specific time, as there wasn't any need to be that troublesome when getting Mr. Fool's help. Looking at the candles and reflected light in front of her, as well as her reflection, Audrey picked up a bottle of extract in excitement and some unease. She then dripped a few droplets onto the dim flame. As the mild and refreshing fragrances filled her nose, for some baffling reason, Audrey recalled the times when she was still a mysticism enthusiast. In the beginning, she would also commit all kinds of mistakes. She would realize that she had forgotten to prepare the essential oils and extracts that would please the deity at a critical moment during the ritual. All she could do was make do with perfume, and her attempts no doubt failed. In fact, according to the information which Mr. Fool shared, he would similarly respond even if I had used my perfume. Audrey exhaled slightly and, using cogitation, calmed herself down. She knew that her uncontrolled thoughts weren't ordinary behavior coming from her. The tiny bit of anticipation and nervousness had been magnified by lie. After making sure she was in an optimal state of mind, Audrey clasped her hands and pressed them to her mouth and nose as if in prayer. She sincerely chanted softly, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Ellipsis." The secret incantation gently echoed 7 times as Audrey felt the surrounding darkness had the inclusion of something which was somewhat indescribable. It was like an undercurrent hidden beneath the water surface. Looking up, Audrey reached out her right hand and passed it through the still candle flame and stroked the mirror's surface from top to bottom. At this point, the magic mirror divination was basically done. If the mysterious and unknown existence's interest was piqued, it would respond through the mirror. Above the gray fog, in the ancient and magnificent palace, Klein looked at the crimson star representing Miss Justice expand and contract as it rippled with an illusory glow. Finally, it was tainted with a nearly black feeling of serenity. It condensed into a circular halo the size of a mirror that appeared to lead to the outer world. It's different from past rituals. Interesting. Klein leaned back into his chair and extended his spirituality to make contact with the black circular hole. Silently, his vision changed. The long bronze table and the crimson star overlapped with the spacious room which was illuminated with candlelight, becoming distinct once again. At this moment, Klein felt that a mirror had become an extension of his body or eye. It allowed him to clearly see and interfere with the real world despite being above the gray fog. Yes, clearly. All the objects in Klein's vision no longer looked blurry as they appeared distinctly in his eyes. His gaze suddenly froze for 2 seconds. In front of him was a golden-laced, white-dressed lady. Her long blonde hair was casually tied up as they smoothly and luxuriantly flowed down. Her emerald eyes reflected a somewhat palish flame, looking as deep as the ocean and also as pure as a gemstone. Her facial features and the shape of her face were matched with a stunning beauty. Her bearing and elegance were clear and pure. Klein shifted his gaze away as he felt guilty for some baffling reason. I nearly imagined her to be a demoness of quite a high sequence. Thankfully, I recalled in time that Miss Justice is a Beyander of the spectator pathway. It's impossible for her to become a demoness. The smell of this extract isn't bad. Very unique. It has a very subtle feeling. The mystical item created from that faceless Beyander characteristic? Miss Justice made it into a necklace. Klein's gaze landed on the mystical item which was disguised as a diamond necklace. Then, he heard Miss Justice say with utmost anticipation, "Mirror, mirror, please tell me the location of the owner of this notebook." Audrey knew that she was asking Mr. Fool, but mirror, mirror, were words she had always wanted to recite from the stories she had heard from a young age. She finally had a chance to use it in practice. The failures in the past don't count. Yes. Audrey nodded inwardly. Klein instantly looked at the black notebook placed between Miss Justice and the candle. He discovered that his spirituality could easily spread out with the help of the mirror. He could hold the divination medium as though he was using his hand. Above the gray fog, he quickly wrote the corresponding divination statement. The location of the original owner of the notebook. With one hand holding the notebook and another hand holding the piece of paper, Klein recited as he leaned back in his chair. With the help of cogitation, he quickly fell into a deep sleep. Audrey looked at the mirror intently with her emerald eyes, awaiting Mr. Fool's reply. After a few seconds, she saw ripples being produced on the mirror's surface. It's a success. Magic mirror divination really works. Audrey's eyes widened as they reflected the scenes flashing inside the mirror. It was a view of a village from above. The scene zoomed in as the dragon drawings on the various buildings gradually turned clear. A cathedral quickly occupied the mirror in its entirety before being replaced by the cemetery attached by it. Finally, the scene was fixed on a tombstone in a corner. On it were words that had turned blurry as a result of the elements. The only thing that could still be discerned was the name, Lindalira. At this moment, the mirror suddenly darkened before restoring to normal. It reflected Audrey and the candle in front of her once again. Isn't this the village which had the customs of dragon worship? The knight who wrote the notebook is named Lindalira, and is from that village. He returned to his hometown after the loss of the 20-year war and stayed there until his death? Or was he sent back to his hometown as a corpse? That village is in East Chester County. Stone City is also part of East Chester County, so it's very understandable that the notebook which Associate Professor Michelle obtained stems from there. There's indeed a mind dragon living in the sea of collective subconscious over there. Feeling enlightened, Audrey thanked Mr. Fool and ended the magic mirror divination. Under the candlelight's illumination, she stared at the notebook for a moment before deciding to hand it over. She wanted to know what the psychology alchemists would divine or figure out. At the very least, the present me lacks the strength to come into contact with that mind dragon. That's all I can do. Besides, even if the psychology alchemists really discover anything and benefits from it, once I slowly rise up the ranks in the organization, some of that will belong to me. Audrey's mood very quickly turned positive once again. Above the gray fog, Klein rapped the corner of the long bronze table. With Miss Justice's description, he made his judgment. The notebook and the village had something to do with a dragon, and dragons often implied treasure. What a pity. Miss Justice's strength is lacking. Otherwise, I would have encouraged her to explore it and pray to the sea god, if something happens while I provide support to her via various means. Yes, it's too dangerous for her. It can only be set aside for now. If the psychology alchemists didn't discover anything, perhaps we can attempt it in the future. Klein suppressed his regret as he recalled the experience of the magic mirror divination. This kind of divination is extremely advantageous for the third party. There's almost no price to be paid to connect to the real world. If I so wished, I could have torn out of the mirror in my spirit body form. But to the user, it's indeed dangerous. They will appear under the sights of an unknown existence without any protection. From there, they can be possessed, controlled, cursed, and corrupted. Klein sighed from the bottom of his heart. He wasn't worried that Miss Justice would abuse magic mirror divination, as she had the best and safest target to pray to. There was no need for her to seek anyone else. And that would be me. Klein retracted his finger and sat at the end of the long bronze table and waited in silence for 20 to 30 seconds. Soon, he returned to the real world. He didn't stay too long since he was on the future. There was someone watching him from the dark. After leaving the bathroom and putting away Azek's copper whistle and Will Ossepton's paper crane, Klein glanced at the crimson moon which had been shrouded by clouds as he pondered silently for a moment. He put on his half-top hat, pulled open the door, and went into the corridor. After taking a few steps forward, Klein deliberately slowed his footsteps and glanced at the first room on the left through the corner of his eye. Based on his judgment, the mysterious pair of eyes that were silently observing him and the deck during the day was in that room. Klein walked slower and slower as he nearly stopped in front of the door. He didn't hide the extension of his left palm as he reached for the handle when scenes naturally surfaced in his mind. Not far behind the door was a clothes rack with nothing hanging on it. Faint starlight scattered across the clean floorboards. There was a sense of solitude and serenity that lacked the aura of humans. The windows had opened at some point in time as the sea breeze blew in from the outside, lifting the curtains which weren't too heavy. There's no one there? Klein had planned on probing the area, but he immediately retracted his left palm and walked towards the stairs as though nothing had happened. When he arrived on the deck and was taking in the cold night breeze, Klein strolled on the starboard with a cold and casual expression as though his main goal was to come out for a stroll. Suddenly, he saw a man sitting ahead of him. The man was wearing dungarees and a white shirt. Frank Lee? Klein didn't stop as he approached. The man sensed something as he turned his body halfway around to look at the person approaching. He was none other than poison expert Frank Lee, but he no longer wore a smile. Streaming down the corner of his mouth was blood-red liquid. Klein pricked up his brows without saying a word. Frank Lee suddenly raised his hands and grabbed a silver-scaled fish that wasn't struggling. He said in depression, "It failed. Their lifespan is shorter than I imagined. It's impossible to breed them, even if they are planted in the ground." As he spoke, he raised the silver-scaled fish in his right hand and bit down on it. "That's good. Otherwise, I'm really afraid of the kind of abominations you would create." "So, you are drowning your sorrows with alcohol, no, fish?" Klein silently heaved a sigh of relief. Klein couldn't go against his own wishes to console Frank Lee, nor could he bring himself to tell Frank Lee that not being able to breed red winefish was a good thing. All he could do was pretend that this was a trivial problem and not provide a response. He walked 2 steps diagonally and circled around the starboard before looking far into the undulating sea. By then, the clouds high in the sky had thinned. The crimson moon's moonlight brightened up the rather dark night. In such an environment, Klein could see the nearby scenery. There were dark clouds that hung low, and he discovered a hurricane swishing back and forth, encompassing an unknown swath of sea. Under the illumination of the silver lightning, fine rain danced amidst the wind, forming a scene that resembled the dawn of the apocalypse. Such a terrifying disaster was only a few nautical miles or even shorter from the future, but the future didn't seem affected. Only the wind had become a little stronger. This is the meaning of a safe sea route, to advance by the side of a storm. Without a good navigator, just traveling normally might push the ship into a disaster. Klein turned his head to look where the ship was heading. He saw a little illumination and fog being emanated. The visibility was extremely low, and using just the naked eye was very difficult to discern if they were in a dangerous or safe zone. Such situations weren't obvious west of Oravi Island. But here, it was common once they took the secret sea route. Klein was just about to retract his gaze when he saw a black, massive object seemingly hiding in the periphery of the storm. A sea monster? He suddenly recalled some of the rumors he had heard at the different bars he had been to. After steering away from the safe sea route, it's very easy to encounter all kinds of monsters. Some of them are behemoths and possess intense offensive power. Once they surfaced from the sea, they could finish it in one mouthful. The future didn't stop advancing. Before long, it closed the gap between it and the gloomy but massive object. Klein finally managed to discern the entity's appearance and discovered that it wasn't a sea monster, but a gigantic sailboat which was even larger than the future. The sailboat was nearly 200 meters long. With its bow and stern raised high, it appeared like a crescent. Its surface was black. The cannons were arranged in 3 rows in an untidy manner on the side of the ship. There was order from top to bottom. Apart from the mast, the portions that extended out of the deck was similarly tall and massive. It was at least equivalent to a 5-story building. This ship's most odd feature was that it only had 1 sail and on it was the drawing of a black tomb. The death announcer. A heavy voice sounded in Klein's ears. At some point in time, Frank Lee had thrown the silver-scaled fish whose blood had been replaced with red wine away and approached his side. The first mate, who had a bounty of 7,000 pounds, held his head heavy as his muscles remained tense. It was as though an attack would be launched anytime from the minute changes of the gigantic sailboat. Death announcer? Klein was first taken aback before he recalled what the name represented. It was one of the most legendary and infamous ships on the 5 seas. It was the flagship of the King of Immortality Agolito. We actually encountered one of the 4 kings. Klein clicked his tongue silently as he uncontrollably entered a highly vigilant state. However, he maintained a superficial level of indifference and calm as he continued looking at the death announcer. Recalling how the second mate of the death announcer, Slaughterer Kirkais, who had a bounty of 9,500 pounds, had recently appeared in Nas and warned him, Kirkais came to an understanding. He was no longer puzzled as to why he would bump into the Death Announcer not far from the Gargaz archipelago. After putting aside this question, he made connections with even more rumors. And among these rumors, there were a number which could be confirmed to be an actual description. King of Immortality Agolito is a middle-aged man who's so pale that he's on the brink of rotting at any moment. The bounty placed on him by a single country reached as high as £100,000. His former enemies are all dead, regardless if they were pirates, adventurers, or members of a naval fleet. Only the other 3 members of the 4 kings remained alive. He has never entered into direct combat with an official demigod. He is extremely restrained in such matters. No one really knows his exact sequence. No one knows what his Beyonder powers are. He's cruel by nature and enjoys killing. He can launch an attack on any person or any ship at random. He liked to find excuses to rip apart promises. Other than his nickname as the King of Immortality, he was often nicknamed the Untrustworthy. Thankfully, I'm on the future. The King of Immortality will likely give Admiral of Stars a free pass. After all, she's one of the 7 pirate admirals. No, the 4 kings and the pirate admirals can cooperate or be at odds normally, apart from the pirate convention organized by the King of the 5 Seas. With the King of Immortality's character, he might not leave any chance of survival. Just as this thought flashed in Klein's mind, he heard a deep, rumbling horn. Whoosh! The sailors who were resting in the cabin jolted awake immediately. Without wearing their clothes, they ran to the different cannons on deck to make preparations to do battle. The future instantly went from a peaceful state to a combative one. Klein turned his head and looked up. He saw that the captain's windows were already open. Catalya wore the usual black dress as she stood there and observed the Death Announcer. She wasn't wearing the thick glasses, and her pitch-black eyes were tainted with some purple, making them mysterious and deep. Indeed, she's also worried about a sudden attack from the King of Immortality. Klein retracted his gaze and looked at the Death Announcer, which had its tail raised up. At this moment, the 2 ships had just passed each other by. The pirates could see their counterparts on the other ship. Similarly, those pirates were also looking over. They maintained a silence resembling that of a statue, as though they had zero emotional fluctuations, brandishing their knives and blowing at the guns. They were being extremely provocative. At that moment, just a matchstick was enough to trigger the tense nerves and begin a war. Finally, the Death Announcer didn't take any actions. It continued silently anchored on the spot, watching the future pass it by before it distanced itself. Phew! At Klein's side, Frank Lee didn't conceal his exhalation. He produced a smile and said to Klein, "Heh, there has always been many rumors about the King of Immortality's strength. Others say that he's really a demigod, while others say that he's only a Sequence 5. He is able to reach the level of a Sequence 4 thanks to the Death Announcer. But regardless, he has lived long enough. Tell me, do you think crossbreeding him and my fishes would enhance their survivability?" Frank suddenly had an idea. "First, you need to capture the King of Immortality. Otherwise, make him interested in your fish." Klein lampooned before calmly saying, "You can discuss it with him." Frank Lee was taken aback as he sighed, depressed. "He won't agree to it. He will plant me into the soil." Just as he said that, the Death Announcer, which had opened a gap with the future, suddenly turned its sails. A shrill laughter which was filled with malice sounded from several hundred meters away as it blanketed the future. Ha ha ha, ha ha ha. The laughter resounded constantly. It switched from being hoarse to chaotic, sounding like ravings or singing at times. The sailors on deck fell to the ground one after another as they tried hard to cover their ears, but all they could do was struggle in pain. A number of Beyonders began to produce fish scales on their bodies. Klein was similarly affected. He felt that his brain was instantly injected with all kinds of thoughts. There were the good, the bad, the bright, and the dark. They were abnormally disordered as they combined with the constantly changing laughter to produce a swelling feeling that could burst one's brain. Klein's facial expression distorted slightly as inconspicuous flesh tendrils began to start wriggling under his skin. If he hadn't experienced the true creator's ravings and Mr. Door's cry for help, or suffer similar torment when he passed the gray fog each time, giving him a certain level of resistance, Klein would definitely be like poison expert Frank Lee, pressing his head, kneeling down with a ferocious expression to resist the pain brought from the terrifying laughter. Klein noticed that some short orange hair was growing from Frank's face, making him seem to transform into a bear. At that moment, the symbols and magical labels on the future's walls, deck, and mast lit up. They became like a resplendent sea of stars in a moonless night. The terrifying laughter, which was either sharp or hoarse, didn't weaken, but everyone was distanced from one another in a second. The sounds that came from a further distance away sounded empty and illusory. Klein's swelling head instantly received reprieve as he used the rest of his strength to look up. Behind the opened windows in the captain's cabin, the Admiral of Stars's face had additional traces of gloominess, and they looked like they would crack apart at any moment, producing horrible items. At that moment, Catalya's palms pressed down on the windowsill as bits of starlight swirled around her, seemingly matching the future which was on the resplendent sea. Whoosh! A squall stirred for no reason as the ship began its own adjustment. Despite the future having so many of its sailors down, it sped up instead of slowing down. It quickly opened up a gap from the death announcer. Klein looked at the room with the mysterious pair of eyes that observed the deck, and he discovered that the windows were rattling from the strong winds without any signs of abnormalities. Whoosh! Amidst the strong winds, starlight descended to form a swath of floating ice, as they dragged the future into a rapid flight. Finally, the death announcer vanished behind it. The terrifying laughter which could make a person lose control or go mad turned more illusory and distant. Frank Lee lowered his hands and panted before barely recovering. Many of the sailors on the deck were still tumbling about and struggling in extreme pain, but their condition didn't worsen. This ability of the King of Immortality is truly impressive. There's almost no way to defend against it. It's no wonder he's one of the four kings. Klein frowned slightly as he sighed. Although he was experienced and rather knowledgeable, this was the first time he was being directly attacked by a demigod in the true sense of the word. He discovered that even Agolito, who was ranked last among the four kings, similarly made him feel weak, as though it was impossible to resist. With Agolito's character, will he make the death announcer pursue us? Although there's a high chance he would wait for Slaughterer Kirkais to return, that possibility cannot be excluded. If he chases up, I'll pray to myself and use the sea god scepter to give him a maelstrom and a thunderstorm to wipe him out. After making the decision, he once again looked at Catalya. The pirate admiral's expression was already ghastly pale. However, there were no longer any signs of darkness. The starlight that twirled around her slowly extinguished one after another. Following the complete disappearance of the surrounding astral glow, Catalya lowered her head and said to Frank Lee, who was slowly recovering, "Let them calm down." She was referring to the sailors who were still struggling in pain. Just as she said that, Catalya shrunk her body back as the windows closed. At that instant, Klein vaguely saw a green vine grow upwards, covering the Admiral of Stars in layers. As he didn't sense any danger or wickedness, he intuitively believed that it was a method in mysticism which Mam Hermit used to treat her injuries and recover her energy. A power of her Beyonder pathway? Or is it from some mystical item she possesses? She began treatment without any worry and allowed Frank to deal with the chaos on the ship. She's not afraid that the death announcer would be able to chase up to us? How far did the future fly in that last pounce? Klein no longer held his neck up as he turned to look at Frank Lee. This first mate, who was both a poison expert and a capable doctor, had already retrieved a coiled soft tube from the pocket of his dungarees. It was connected to a small glass bottle, and on the other side was an embedded thin and sharp needle. "A sedative I concocted," Frank Lee said with a forced smile while still having pangs of fear. "I've bought something similar before. They were all given to Zombie Marich." Klein surveyed the area and said, "This might not be enough." "No, it's not for them. I need a helper. They will receive the help of beer, which comes with a sedative effect." "Haha, they're often rowdy once they're drunk, so I've added the necessary elements in most of the alcohol buckets," Frank explained in passing. Spiking their drinks without any notice. Klein nearly twitched the corner of his mouth. At that moment, he had a deep appreciation for the aptness of the nickname, Poison Expert. Simply because he found the pirates rowdy when drunk, Frank had added a modified sedative to most of the alcoholic beverages without any sense of guilt or shame. It was as though he was doing something very ordinary. This fellow is a really straight and warm person in certain aspects, but in other aspects, he's more terrifying than a devil. This is because he doesn't believe that what he does is evil. How did the Church of Mother Earth produce such a crazy scientist? Klein controlled his expression and followed Frank Lee from a distance and found the bosun, Nina, who was squirming in the shadows of the bulkhead. This pirate with an exaggerated figure was slumped there, writhing in pain. She kept scratching the deck, producing ear-piercing sounds as bloody marks were left behind. Just watching the scene made Klein feel pain in his fingers. "Gehrman, help me press her down to prevent her from struggling." Frank raised the needle and tube in his hand. Klein didn't object to it, but he didn't say a word. He calmly crouched by the side and pressed down on Nina's shoulders. He felt his hands slip the moment he touched her, finding it difficult to grab her. It was as though she wasn't a lady but a gigantic fish covered in slippery scales. Klein instantly corrected his actions. Using a clown's precise control, he grabbed Nina firmly by the shoulders. However, Nina's struggling was surprisingly strong, far greater than Klein's. Soon, he felt his fingers turn sore as he could hardly continue. As expected of a Sequence 7 Beyonder from the Sailor Pathway, while I'm not a Beyonder who excels when it comes to physical strength. If not for the need to feed it, I can activate Creeping Hunger and switch to steal Maveti's soul and use the strength of a zombie as a most suitable response. As these thoughts ran through his mind, Klein saw Frank approach, crouch down, and press his knee onto Nina's back. His muscles bulged as he quickly stopped Nina's struggling. A Beyonder from the Plantar Pathway has quite a lot of physical strength as well. However, Mr. Frank Lee, it's probably difficult for you to get a girlfriend if you use such crude manners against a lady. Of course, you definitely don't mind. You could totally let your child grow from the soil. Klein lampooned as he watched Frank Lee inject the needle into the back of Nina's hand. As the small bottle of sedatives was injected, Nina stopped her attempts at struggling. Klein released his hands and stood up. After a few seconds, Nina combed her hair and rolled to her feet. She grumbled at Frank Lee, "Why must you always be so rough like a bear? Can't you try a different method?" As she spoke, she stretched her arms without concealing the pained expression on her face. Unlike the dive from earlier, she was now wearing a linen shirt and a brown coat. She looked no different from an ordinary pirate. Frank wasn't fazed by Nina's complaints as he asked in puzzlement, "How was I rough?" "All right, let's not argue on this topic. Let's help them first. Get the beer barrel out. Let's work together to make them drink. Gehrman, you don't mind participating in this, right?" Klein shot a glance at the sailors on the deck. After contemplating for a few seconds, he asked, "The goal is to let them calm down?" "That's right." Frank Lee nodded heavily. "Can I just knock them unconscious?" Klein asked calmly. "This has almost the same effects as a sedative beer, and it's more efficient," he added inwardly. Nina turned her head in surprise and was momentarily stunned speechless. Frank Lee thought seriously for a moment. "Okay, all right." Klein walked to a cutlass he had long noticed, picked it up, and used the dull edge to strike it at its owner. Bang! Through his precise control, the pirate who was rolling in pain calmed down and fell unconscious. Nina's expression froze for a second before she recovered. She then slowed down when passing by Klein. She suppressed her laughter as she said, "I've heard rumors of you, but I never expected you to be more exaggerated than the rumors. Usually, it should be the opposite. Yes, your thoughts are very, very special. Completely different from others, and they're closer to those of Frank's. This is probably why he's able to treat you as a friend in such a short time. No, there are differences among lunatics. Gehrman Sparrow hasn't reached the level of Frank yet." Klein observed silently and gave such a reply inwardly. He ignored Nina and held the cutlass and walked across the deck, knocking the sailors unconscious and waiting for them to wake up naturally. Frank wished to do the same, but he gave up his rash thoughts when he was asked by Nina if he could guarantee that he only knocked them unconscious instead of killing them. He entered the cabin and brought out a beer barrel and acted according to his original plan. Bam! 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 Klein struck as he walked all the way to the bow. At this moment, an elder in his 50s with a pointed bonnet had gradually come round. When he saw the cold and crazy adventurer approach, he hurriedly tried to stand up and blurted out, "No, I don't need it. I'm already fine. I'm fine. There's no need to explain. It's very clear." Klein held back his amusement and turned for the bow. At this moment, the elder introduced himself. "I'm the navigator of the future, Atolov." "Navigator?" Klein turned his head and discovered several books dropped around Atolov. They were either spread on the ground face up or down, flat or sideways. "Haha, I fell from above and brought them with me. They nearly went mad," Atolov explained. Klein shifted his gaze towards his eyes and discovered the colors of the deep sea in his blue eyes. "It's not the pair of eyes that were observing me in the day. But this feeling is somewhat similar to the Admiral of Stars. They are of the same pathway?" Klein retracted his gaze and watched Nina and Frank Lee calm the other sailors. Just as he was about to look back to see if the death announcer had continued its pursuit, Atolov suddenly shouted, "Be careful." Whoosh! A huge wave struck the bow, causing the future to shake vigorously. If not for his balancing ability as a clown, Klein would have fallen like Frank. And when the huge spray pattered down like rain, it drenched his half-top hat and double-breasted frock coat. There should be a steam iron here, right? The act of a crazy adventurer washing his clothes doesn't violate his persona. It's weird if he doesn't wash his clothes. I should have worn clothes in the style of the Rørsted archipelago natives. At that instant, Klein felt a series of heartache. He saw a storm ahead with huge waves coming one after another as they surged high up like mountains. He could sense the crazy winds and the rumbling thunder. We've come to the boundaries of the safe sea routes? The flight from just now might have allowed us to lose the death announcer's tail, but it has also diverted the ship from its path? Klein watched as Atolov, Nina, and Frank, as well as bloodless Heath Doyle, who had appeared at some point in time, wake up the sailors as they took their places. They frantically and busily began to steer the future. Through their hard work, the future changed directions in time and tore through the gigantic waves and dodged the bolts of lightning before returning to the safe sea route. After everything calmed down, Klein released the charm from the sea god domain and breathed a sigh of relief. Looking back, he saw no signs of the death announcer's pursuit. He finally eased up and found that there was nothing calm about the night. After surveying the area and seeing the pirates rub their heads or gasp for breath, looking exhausted and on the brink of collapse, Klein left the deck, feeling a slight guilty conscience. He walked to the cabin and sighed inwardly. We just left the Gargas archipelago recently and the ship was nearly destroyed. The search for mermaids really doesn't seem simple. Following the staircase to the upper level, Klein walked past the captain's cabin and slowed down. He observed for a moment and saw green leaves covering the crack in the door. Everything was isolated. He shifted his gaze and returned to his room. He considered the matter of praying to the fool before going above the grey fog to grasp the nearby waters and search for traces of the death announcer by responding. He wanted to let the King of Immortality Agolito, who attacked others for no baffling reason, to experience the same treatment as he did. No, there are eyes watching. I should try my best not to do such things. Besides, it will only teach the King of Immortality a lesson and not seriously injure him. It's not worth the risk. I shouldn't let my anger get the better of my rationality. I'll think about it again after advancing successfully. Klein repressed his urge. Backland, outside the steam locomotive station. Furs wore a finely checkered black veiled hat with embedded blue flowers and stood by the hall at the station's entrance, awaiting her teacher, Dorian Gray. The drizzle on the streets and the cold winds blowing underground had made this female author tremble slightly. She felt that she had underestimated Backland's spring. I wonder what Zio is doing that makes her busy all year round. Sigh, she said that she wouldn't even get out of bed when her father was still alive. Apart from going to the bathroom, both food and water would be served to her by her servants. Now, she's leaving early in the morning every day and only returning late at night regardless of the weather. She has completed one mission after another, capturing one fugitive after another. With this in mind, Furs couldn't help but admire Zio. Last week, this female sheriff had already paid off her debt and had even saved up £200. I have to say that, as a Beyonder job, a sheriff is really suited to being a bounty hunter. Of course, the choices available to her are limited to low-sequence Beyonders. Furs's thoughts wandered as her gaze that was directed outwards had suddenly caught sight of a familiar figure. It was a man of medium build, and he was dressed in a black suit, the most popular attire in Loen. He wore a half-top hat, and in a rare instance, his shoulders appeared broad. It was broad in an almost exaggerated sense. He was none other than Furs's teacher, one of the few remaining members of the Abraham family, Dorian Gray Abraham. Furs was delighted as she immediately went over with her umbrella in hand. With so many people on the streets, she didn't directly approach him. However, her gaze met his and saw him raise his clenched right fist towards the first button on his black suit. This means danger. Furs's expressionlessly diverted her gaze away. She smiled as she cast her gaze to a young gentleman behind Dorian, and as though nothing happened, she passed him and walked forward. An ancient family had unimaginable experience in all kinds of matters, so Dorian Gray had long informed Furs of the signals and gestures to use in urgent situations. The action from before was extremely simple. It was to inform her to stay away. The young man behind was somewhat taken aback to be stared at by the languid, mature lady. Following that, he instinctively adjusted his clothes and pressed down on his hat. Just as he finished these series of actions, Furs had overtaken him and continued heading forward. Under the drizzle, Furs circled the area and boarded a rental carriage and headed for Hat Trick Inn on Sherwood Burrows 22 Hope Street. This was the place that Dorian Gray had reserved in advance. Having spent so many years in mysticism circles, Furs, who had plenty of experience, calmly got a neighboring room and stood before the window to observe the guests that came to the inn. Finally, she saw Dorian Gray get off a carriage and walk through the door. Furs quickly turned around and came to the bend of the stairwell. She covertly observed her teacher being led to his room by an attendant. After a while, she took off her hat, messed up her hair a little before coming to room 2016, and she knocked on it. Her plan was very simple. If her teacher's response wasn't problematic, she would enter the room to converse with him. If it was abnormal, she would pretend as though she had come to the wrong room or that she was a prostitute trying to get some business. Creak. The door slowly opened as Dorian looked at his student in front of him before looking both ways down the corridor. Then, he raised his right arm and spread his fingers to press on the second button of his suit. This meant that he wasn't controlled and that the abnormality was over. Furs let out a silent sigh of relief and instantly entered the room. "Teacher, what happened just now?" she asked, feeling worried and concerned. Dorian closed the door and smiled wryly. "I saw someone familiar." He sighed and added, "An enemy." It was his former student who had later betrayed the Abraham family with Traveler Bulaya and nearly wiped out the upper echelons of the Abraham family. According to what Dorian knew, his former student had already joined the Aurora Order and was likely one of the 22 oracles. "What did he do? Is he very strong?" Furs asked curiously. Dorian fell silent for a few seconds and divulged a little. "Lawrence, Laubero, Alisa, and I belong to a particular organization. A few members betrayed it and dealt a heavy blow to it. That was one of the traitors. He didn't mention it as a family, nor did he mention the conflict between bloodline members and the apprentices so as to prevent Furs from getting her feelings involved. How despicable." Furs immediately recalled the kind Mrs. Alisa and the friendly and amiable Mr. Lawrence. "All right, let's not chat about such unhappy matters." Dorian took out a piece of paper that had been folded a few times and handed it to Furs. "Here's the astrologer potion formula. Your digestion of the Trickmaster and Apprentice potions has exceeded my expectations. This is the greatest surprise I've had in the past 10 years. I specially joined a circus." Furs didn't hide the fact, and she even felt that it was worth flaunting. As she spoke, she unfolded the piece of paper to read the astrologer's potion formula. At this moment, Dorian nodded in relief. "I'm very sorry. Due to the previous losses, I'm unable to provide you with the main ingredients of the astrologer potion. Just treat it as a final test. However, I have prepared a gift for you." As he spoke, he took out a palm-sized notebook from his inner left pocket. Its cover looked hard, and it was entirely bronze green in color. It looked rather ancient. The notebook was comprised of 3 types of paper. The yellow type of parchment had the fewest pages, while another was a yellowish-brown goatskin of about 10 pages, while the rest was ordinary white paper. On the cover there were the words written in ancient Fasak. "I came, I saw, I record." Furs's gaze moved away from the astrologer potion formula and onto the notebook. She recognized it to be the item left behind by Mr. Lawrence. It was the item she had specially traveled all the way to Pritz Harbor to hand to her teacher. Dorian smiled. "I believe you are no stranger to it." After Furs nodded, he sighed. "This is a rather potent mystical item. It can be ranked in the top 5 among all the similar items I've seen. This doesn't mean that it's more impressive than the ones ranked after it, but it's simply because the negative effects are the easiest to resolve. When the two are put together, it makes it worth a lot." "What is its name? What negative side effects does it have?" Furs couldn't disguise her excitement and agitation. Dorian caressed the notebook's cover and said, "It's called Leymano's Travels, but we prefer calling it Leymano's Spellbook. While this spellbook will expose you to more kinds of Beyonder powers, it can also allow you to record them. It will be materialized onto a particular page for long-term storage. You can use it at any time, but remember, the corresponding page will become blank again with each use, awaiting your next record." Ellipsis. It sounds amazing. Furs felt as though she was dreaming. "I can record any Beyonder powers I see and use them once? Isn't this another kind of shepherd? The shepherd mentioned by Little Sun. Yes, it's only limited to a single prepared battle. I wonder if I can record the Beyonder powers of a demigod. If it's possible, in a prepared battle, I'll be even stronger than a shepherd." Dorian seemed to read her mind as he explained in detail. "It can be said so. It corresponds to a sequence 6 scribe of the apprentice pathway. It's not guaranteed that a Beyonder power that is higher than this sequence can be recorded. There's a chance of failure. The greater the gap, the greater the chance of failure." Furthermore, the effects will be halved. According to the experience of past users, while chances of success against a Sequence 5's Beyonder powers is considerably high, once it reaches Sequence 4, which is the level of a demigod, it becomes relatively difficult. There might not be a single instance of success within 10 attempts. And I believe no demigod will cast it again and again for you. If it's an enemy, they would have killed you 10 times over. Do you see these? The yellow parchment is specifically used to record Beyonder powers with godhood. There are a total of 3 pages, which is to say that even if you are very lucky, all you can record is 3 demigod Beyonder powers, and you can only use them each once. Although it appears to have many restrictions, making it impossible to fully produce the traveling notebook's might, it isn't an obstacle for 2 types of people. One of them is a lucky person, while the other is someone with a large organization or faction backing them, the kind which has a demigod helping. Furs instantly thought of seeking Mr. Fool's help to display his powers so that she could record them. However, she immediately found it sacrilegious as she hurriedly apologized inwardly. Following that, she sincerely hoped that the supposedly strongest Ma'am Hermit in the Tarot Club would quickly become a demigod. Dorian noticed that Furz's thoughts were going astray as he continued. The pages like Goatskin can record the Beyonder powers of a Sequence 5 or 6. There are a total of 10 pages, and the effects would be more than half of the original, roughly 70 to 80%. The remaining pages record Beyonder powers below Sequence 6. There are a total of 25 pages, and the effects are almost equal to the original, but they are still slightly inferior. Due to some developments in the past, the spellbook still has 5 pages with Beyonder powers left. The rest are blank. You can test them for yourself. Dorian paused before saying with a solemn expression, before giving it to you, I have to seriously warn you that it has negative effects. After using it each time, it will make you get lost, and it's the kind that causes you to encounter danger. You have to draw a bit of your blood to smear it on the cover evenly to reduce the effects. Remember, don't underestimate getting lost. You must resolve it as quickly as possible. Yes, teacher, Furs replied seriously. Dorian then handed Lemano's travels to Furs. This is my gift. Teacher is really nice. Furs pursed her lips and asked, what's the name of that student who betrayed you? What does he look like? If there's a chance, I wish to seek vengeance on him for both you and Mr. Lawrence. No, don't think about it. You are much weaker than him. Back when he betrayed us, he was already a scribe. Now, he might even be a traveler, Dorian said solemnly. However, you do need to remember him and avoid him. His name is Louis Ween. I'll draw a picture of him later. All right, Furs nodded. On the future, in the pirates' dining hall, Klein met Catalya, who was exiting just as he walked in. The lady was no longer as pale as the previous night. With a pair of thick glasses, she calmly said, make your preparations. We will be arriving in those waters in a while. That fast? How far exactly did we fly last night? Klein was taken aback. Although Gehrman Sparrow didn't show it on his face, Catalya seemed to notice the surprise in him. She simply explained, it's a kind of flight that makes it impossible for the death announcer to continue its pursuit. Just as she said that, she discovered that Gehrman Sparrow had completely changed his attire. He wore a round neck shirt, a brown jacket, pantaloons with a dark-colored cap. He didn't look like an adventurer and instead resembled a native of the city of Generosity, Bayam. According to Nina, his clothes were drenched by a huge wave last night. Does he only have one set of decent clothes? Catalya recalled and found the reason. She wasn't surprised by this. She even felt that it matched Gehrman Sparrow's insanity. He only had one set of decent clothes, spending the rest of his money on mystical items, Beyonder weapons, spirituality charms, with the sole goal of raising his strength. It's no wonder the King of Immortality gave up. All he did was attack passing ships. There wasn't enough hatred to drive him to pursue us the entire way. Yes, in front of the 4 kings, senior pirate admirals still have a chance to escape to a certain degree. Almost arriving. Man, I haven't completed my digestion. However, acting as the crazy adventurer yesterday seemed rather effective. The crew of the future gave a very spontaneous and warm response towards it. I should completely digest it in 2 to 3 days. And even if we entered the dangerous waters, finding mermaids wouldn't be that simple. I should have enough time. Klein nodded and suppressed his urge to ask. He planned on passing by Admiral of Stars and head to his usual spot to have breakfast. At this moment, he saw a pirate who was carrying a blue fish which was alive and kicking rush in. He went straight for a corner. Seated there was the second mate of the future, Heath Doyle. His face was nearly transparent from the paleness, and his nose bridge was rather unharmonious. Paw! The fish, which was nearly a meter long, was placed in front of Bloodless. Heath Doyle extended his hands and pressed down on the fish. He bent his body bit by bit as he inched his head downwards, plastering his face to the scales as though he was kissing it. Suddenly, the fish stiffened and, like wax meeting fire, melted rapidly and turned into a disgusting pool of flesh and blood. The flesh and blood surged into Heath Doyle's mouth like liquid as they covered his skin. Amidst the horrendous sight of the squirming, the fish and all the bones, flesh, and blood vanished. Nothing was left behind as Heath Doyle's face appeared very clean. All that was left was the bright red color on his lips like a blooming rose. Rose Bishop. The name of the sequence surfaced in Klein's mind. Catalya, who was beside him, also saw the scene as she nudged her glasses. Every Rose Bishop needs to replenish themselves with enough blood and flesh. That way, they can fully showcase their Beyonder powers and not lose control after being injured as a result of an intense battle. Her lips curled slightly as she added, however, the lunatics from the Aurora Order have an inclination towards human flesh and blood. Actually, substitutes would work fine. From the looks of it, this Bloodless with a bounty of 7,600 pounds is really lucky. On the one hand, he's lucky to achieve Sequence 6 at once without any abnormalities or losing control. On the other hand, joining Admiral of Stars's pirate crew is another. Without the secret knowledge that this lady who is being pursued by knowledge possesses, he might have turned into a monster that desires human flesh and blood sooner or later, even if he didn't listen to the true creator's voice. Klein sighed silently. He was increasingly convinced that the secret suppliant pathway, which was also the shepherd pathway, was the Beyonder pathway, which was the easiest to lose control and turn mad. Nothing came close. Even the Abyss pathway, which represented evil, was slightly lacking. Klein retracted his gaze, and just as he was about to take a step forward, the entire ship jolted. In an instant, the scene ahead of the future naturally surfaced in Klein's mind. The blue sea was being separated by a gigantic crack as infinite amounts of seawater plummeted down into bottomless darkness like a waterfall. This scene was magnificent and mystical. It made one suspect if they weren't on Earth. Whoosh! The future wasn't able to stop in time as it rushed to the edge and quickly plummeted. Bang! 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 All the pirates in the dining hall flew up and slammed into the ceiling. Toast, white bread, butter, margarine, beer, and roasted fish flew around at random without settling down. Klein also lost his balance as he couldn't help but be thrown towards the ceiling. He extended his palm in time and pressed upwards, quickly adjusting his posture like an acrobatic act, allowing him to look less pathetic. Not far away, Nina showcased her stunning balance. With the help of the ceiling, she maintained her posture. Perhaps intentionally or unintentionally, she extended her feet and kicked Frank to send the poison expert flying diagonally to a beer barrel, drenching him with pale yellow liquid. At this moment, the most casual and unfazed person was Catalya. Stars swirled around her as the resplendence beneath her feet coagulated, causing her to float in midair. She wasn't affected by the sudden dip. Apart from her, Bloodless was the least pathetic. At some point in time, this Rose Bishop had blended into the shadows and disappeared. With the future about to plummet into the bottomless crevice, a plume of water surged up suddenly. It held up the ship and threw it high into the air and towards the other edge. After momentarily floating in the air, Klein believed that the future had landed stably on the surface of the sea. Once again, the charm from the sea god domain, which he held tightly in his right hand, wasn't used. At that moment, the sunlight outside the window shone inside, illuminating the mess inside the dining hall. Klein, who had long regained his balance, briskly walked to the window and saw that the endless sea seemed to be burning with golden flames. It appeared to have been noon the entire time. It was only morning moments ago. Klein looked up and narrowed his eyes to see that the sky was filled with sunlight. There were no clouds nor the sun, just a swath of golden rays. It's no wonder Arides's description of this place is that it's no longer a real ocean, but a relic of a war between the gods. As he swept his gaze, he discovered nearby ruins which were diagonally ahead. The ruins were mostly covered by seawater. Protruding out from the surface was grey stones and stone columns that formed a peak. At the top was a dome-like object. From its angle, it was able to hold up quite a large area of space. The ruins were definitely massive in the first place. Through the transparent waters, Klein saw that its base extended to the seabed without end. These are extremely dangerous waters. At some point in time, Catalya came beside him. Klein turned his head over and waited for her to continue. Catalya's gaze was cast forward as she said somewhat wistfully, I haven't been here many times. Furthermore, all my visits happened a long time ago. My, and not, our. That means that it wasn't with the crew of the future. Or was it back when she was a subordinate of Queen Mystic? Klein acutely noticed the terms which Admiral of Stars had used as he made a guess. Catalya didn't turn her head as she looked at the sky and sea which were covered in golden flames. No one knows where the ends of these waters are. Nor does anyone know how wide it is. Do you know what's most dangerous about this place? I should have gotten a Rhodes to give me a more detailed explanation. Klein honestly shook his head. Previously, he had nearly been caught by a demigod of the true creator. He had only survived thanks to the die of probability. Therefore, in the past 2 months, he didn't dare bring the radio transceiver back to the real world. He was afraid that the true creator, who was closely watching the region, would sense it. Hence, he didn't have an opportunity to contact a Rhodes. His original plan was to seek out Will Ossepton's help through the paper crane once he approached the dangerous waters, and understand the corresponding dangers of the environment. To his surprise, they had encountered King of Immortality Agolito, and the future didn't give him any time before they arrived at their destination. Behind the thick glasses, Catalya's black eyes with a purple hue glazed over for a moment. There are many ruins floating here. There are all kinds of mutated monsters. Among them include many demigods who have lost control or ancient evil creatures. This isn't the most dangerous part. If it's only because of this, these waters would have become a hunting ground for the 7 churches, a treasure trove for them to obtain high-sequence ingredients or items. Of course, there are many monsters and evil creatures who have lost control here, but they might not be real. They can kill us, but they might not leave anything behind after they are killed. Upon hearing this, Klein made the connection to the Dragon of Imagination, Ancualt. This Dragon King could conjure anything through his imagination. Could it be that these waters were where the ancient gods of the second epic fought? Klein nearly frowned. Catalya said with an ethereal voice as she continued, Here, you will never guess what dangers you will encounter next. Perhaps you will just melt while approaching a ruin, turning into a wax-like monster. Perhaps you might turn into a rock amidst the storms from slightly deviating from the explored sea routes and end up shattering to pieces. To Beyonders at our level, that is the greatest danger. Klein turned his head slightly as he sharply asked, What about Beyonders that surpass our levels? Catalya sighed and smiled. The waters here are filled with a voice that shouldn't be heard. The higher the sequence, the easier it is to hear it. Therefore, most demigods who dare explore these waters have ended up with problems. They either went mad or lost control, ending up lost here forever. It's no wonder the 7 churches don't send their experts here to reap the harvest. Most of them ended up with problems. Which means that there are a small number of demigods that can survive here. Enlightened, Klein looked out the window again. At this moment, the future had closed in on the ruins. Suddenly, a loud and clear panting was heard by everyone. Whoosh! Gasp! The loud panting sounds entered Klein's ears in a slow and rhythmic manner. It left a chill running down his spine as he felt an inexplicable sense of horror, but he didn't feel any dangerous foreboding. It wasn't only him. Catalya, Frank Lee, and the other pirates also heard the panting sounds. They either turned their heads, looked outside, raised their weapons, or were on high alert, showcasing their rich experience. After trying to discern the source, Klein discovered that the intense panting stemmed from the ruin ahead of them. It originated from a spot between the peak made of stones and stone columns. At that moment, bloodless Heath Doyle floated out of the shadows. He clasped his head and softly grunted in pain. There's a corpse. There's a corpse there. Corpse? A corpse that pants loudly? Klein's thoughts raced. Catalya, who had subconsciously removed her heavy glasses and looked towards the ruins, had her expression suddenly turn solemn. She turned her head towards the pirates in the dining hall and said, Quick! Quickly circle around that area and do not approach it. Her voice contained a magnetic allure that jolted everyone awake. The sailors rushed out of the dining hall and headed for spots that needed help. Under Navigator Atolov and Bosun Nina's instructions, they adjusted the sails and changed direction, passing by the ruins from a relatively great distance. Only when the peak formed by stone and stone columns vanished beyond the horizon did bloodless Heath Doyle lower his hands, his expression no longer in pain. Upon seeing this scene, Klein narrowed his eyes. He felt that this Rose Bishop, the second mate of the future, might be a huge latent risk on this voyage. This wasn't because of his contempt towards Beyonders of the Secret's suppliant pathway, but a judgment he made from combining the Admiral of Stars's description and how Heath Doyle had reacted. Just now, Heath Doyle was the only one in pain while everyone heard the loud panting. He instinctively believed that there was a corpse buried in the ruins, and Catalya's reaction after her observation proved his words. That means that even if Heath Doyle doesn't proactively listen to the true creator's voice, just by having the Beyonder powers of a listener is enough to make him hear more than the average person and most low- and mid-sequence Beyonders in ordinary environments. Hence, he was affected the most and obtained more information on the danger when we encountered the panting sounds while being sufficiently close to the source of the sounds. Here, it doesn't mean that problems can be resolved by avoiding similar ruins. Because according to Catalya, these waters are filled with voices that can make a demigod lose control, voices that shouldn't be heard. If Heath Doyle were to be in an inadequate or overly adequate state one day, he might end up hearing those lethal whispers. Similarly, even if a sequence 6 rose bishop is inferior to a demigod who is good at listening, the gap can't be too huge. In terms of the die of probability, just 2 points, not 1 point, is enough to have Heath Doyle hear voices he shouldn't hear to go mad or lose control. I have to warn Ma'am Hermit even though she should have long figured this out and made the corresponding preparations. Klein retracted his gaze and heard his stomach groan softly. He had yet to have breakfast. At this moment, beer was splashed across the floor. Butter had been splattered everywhere. All kinds of food, roasted fish, toast, white bread, were strewn across the floor or hanging off of something. All of them had become somewhat dirty. It should still be edible by peeling off the outer layer. Klein looked at a piece of bread that was leaning on a table leg, in a dilemma on his course of action. This was at odds with Gehrman Sparrow's persona. When he decided to wait for lunch, Catalya instructed the chef, prepare breakfast for the rest once more. Leave this to Frank. Perhaps he has uses for it. For the rearing of monsters? Klein lampooned inwardly. After a while, he finally had breakfast which wasn't as sumptuous as before. It was a smoked pork sausage and 2 utterly burnt toast, as well as a cup of unsedated light beer that was treated as water. Due to them traveling through very dangerous waters with the possibilities of mishaps happening at every turn, Klein showcased his eating skills from back when he was studying in college. He only spent 1 to 2 minutes to finish the breakfast just like he did back in his college's mess hall. He left the pirates' dining hall and came to the deck. He was having an after-meal stroll while also observing his environment. At that moment, the sea still appeared as though it was illuminated by a midday sun as it was colored gold. Klein stopped and looked into the distance and saw a point of light ahead expanding. Under the sun's illumination, the point of light was producing coruscating, multicolored lusters due to the refraction. It was like a gigantic and transparent gem. As the future continued forging ahead, the point of light gradually revealed itself. It first parted before becoming clear. It was comprised of 4 gigantic columns made of pure diamond. They were like legendary columns that held up the sea. They extended downwards and stably stood there, holding up a sizable floating island. Above the floating island, the soil was charred black without any hint of greenery. In its depths, the lights had such an abnormal brightness that it outshone the midday sky. Suddenly, there was a long screech that was emitted from the island. It was loud and unrestrained, but it gave people a hair-raising sense of danger. Before long, Klein heard the galloping sounds of horses as he saw 2 steeds that seemed to be tempered from gold rush out of the floating island. Behind it was a beautiful chariot which was similarly made from gold. At this moment, Catalya's voice was amplified as she hurriedly had it resound in every corner of the future. Look down. Don't look at it. Klein was never one to put on a brave front. He subconsciously lowered his head upon hearing those words and looked at his leather boots. He noticed that the sunlight which illuminated the deck was becoming brighter before it dimmed and was rapidly restored to its former brilliance. It's all right now. Catalya's voice sounded in the ship again without any obvious emotional fluctuations. Only then did Klein look up. He discovered that the 2 steeds tempered from gold and the beautiful chariot they pulled behind it had vanished. The diamond pillar silently supported the floating island as resplendent glows swirled around it. What a huge diamond! What a strange floating island! What would happen if I hadn't lowered my head and had watched the golden chariot charge forward? Klein looked around as he suddenly frowned. A pirate who stood about 7 to 8 meters away from him had already vanished. Standing there were 2 pitch-black footprints. Looking at the ashes floating in midair, Klein vaguely knew the outcome of not lowering his head. Thankfully, Admiral of Stars has been here a few times in the past. She knows what to avoid and when to bow her head. If I had hired Mr. Hanged Man, even if he was the one steering the ghost ship, we might have already been wiped out by now. No, if the future hadn't arrived at its destination ahead of time without giving me any time to prepare, I would have long sought out Will Ossepton's advice. A magician never performs unprepared. Besides, if I had hired Mr. Hanged Man, I definitely would have purchased the relevant information from Ma'am Hermit. Klein first sighed before recovering his calm. He didn't suggest visiting the floating island to explore it. He left the future to pass it by and head forward. In the rest of the time, the sea was like the outer world. There were only the undulating waves, the vastness, silence, and endlessness. Klein occasionally saw fire embers floating on the surface of the sea, but he didn't find any signs of marine creatures, including mermaids. Time ticked by, and lunch was soon underway. Just as Klein was about to leave the deck for the dining hall, he suddenly realized that his surroundings had darkened. The sky, which had remained in a midday state, no longer had any sunlight as it was covered in rich darkness. This change was so sudden and fast that Klein's first reaction was to wonder who had switched off the lights. Silently, the future was covered in a layer of resplendent stars that illuminated paths in every direction. Catalya's voice that contained a magnetic allure was once again magnified as it resounded in everyone's ears. Return to your room or find any corner you can and make yourself fall asleep. Then, wait until you wake up naturally. Puzzled, Frank Lee asked loudly, "What will happen if I don't sleep?" At that moment, his voice boomed like a speaking bear. Catalya stood behind the window of the captain's cabin and said, "When we wake up, we will find you gone, never to be found again." The night here is that terrifying? Klein was curious, but he had no thoughts of attempting to stay awake. He returned to his room, and using the starlight which hadn't been extinguished on the future, he unfolded a paper crane and picked up a pencil to quickly write. What should be taken note of when traveling to the dangerous waters on the easternmost front of the Sonia Sea? Where can I find mermaids there? Putting down the pencil, he folded the crane. Without taking off his coat, he lay in bed and, with the help of cogitation, quickly fell asleep. In a hazy world, he suddenly jolted awake, clearly knowing that he was dreaming. No one is infiltrating it. Klein surveyed his surroundings and found himself on a mountaintop. Behind him and to his sides were black, cloister-like buildings. Ahead of him was a withered tree and a protruding boulder. On top of the boulder, Catalya sat alone. She hugged her knees and leaned her body forward as she stared at the mountain opposite them. She was still dressed in the black classical robe that exuded an air of mystery. Her expression wore an indescribable look of confusion. At that moment, she didn't move at all. It was as though she was a stone sculpture. Why is she in my dream? Klein took a few steps forward and leapt onto a boulder. Before he could ask, he was stunned by the vast scene before his eyes. It was a feeling that struck a blow to his body and soul. In front of the boulder was a bottomless cliff, and across the cliff was a mountain which was covered with countless palaces, spires, and majestic city walls. These buildings were opulent and stacked in circles. Just one of them was abnormally huge and didn't resemble a human's residence. Combined together, it had an indescribable sense of epic proportions that seemed legendary or mythical. The sun hung far away as it cast the colors of the sunset onto the city as the light seemed to be frozen. This is a dream shared by all of us. Catalya continued sitting there, hugging her legs as she said, as though she was in a reverie. A dream shared by everyone? Klein repeated Catalya's words inwardly as he slowly realized the situation he was in. Nighttime in these dangerous waters would connect the dreams of all living creatures. And any creature that didn't sleep would lack the necessary protection, as their soul bodies weren't in the dream. As such, they would suffer an unknown attack. As for why such an attack would lead to one's disappearance and not instant death, Klein, who hadn't actually experienced it, had no grounds for speculation. As his thoughts raced, Klein retracted his gaze from Catalya's body, recasting them onto the magnificent city on the opposite cliff. He thought out of curiosity. If this world can really be formed from the connection of dreams from all the local creatures, who could have imagined such an unimaginable city? He observed for a few seconds before asking, what is its name? What's the name of this city that can only exist in myths and legends? Catalya stared ahead in a daze as she spoke, as though she was in a reverie. No idea. There will be a chance of seeing it every time we enter the dream, but it's impossible to approach. She said that it resembles the Great Twilight Hall in Fasak. She likely has her own guesses, but she has never told me. She? That queen mystic? The Great Twilight Hall is where the Church of the God of Combat's papal chair is. Klein surveyed the area and deliberated before saying, I plan to look around. He believed that the future wouldn't leave these waters anytime soon. He would definitely encounter more knights and enter this dream world several times. Therefore, to defend against any accidents and to obtain intel, it was necessary for him to explore the area. And the exploration no doubt needed a partner. Catalya remained sitting there, hugging her knees. Her tone remained ethereal as she said, "Not interested. Ellipsis. This isn't what a mature pirate admiral should say. You could have been more euphemistic. Ma'am Hermit, you resemble a young petulant lady." Klein was taken aback as he suspected if he had misheard. This was in conflict with the Admiral of Stars he had in his mind. Thinking of how Gehrman Sparrow also had his side of not being afraid of dirt and hardship, he came to a realization. He quickly made a guess. Catalya isn't completely awake in the dream. She is able to know that she's in a dream, but she's unable to effectively control it. That is to say that she would unknowingly depict the feelings buried deep in her heart and reveal some of her personality which she usually suppresses. It's no wonder she said that she was never able to approach that miraculous city. It's because she never had the intention of exploring it herself. Klein thought for a moment and deliberately probed, "We might be able to discover something over there." Not going, Catalya didn't hesitate to reply, but she never shook her head. "I'll be here waiting." Waiting. She really is in a semi-unconscious state. Klein made the judgment based on her reaction and tone. He didn't waste any more time and turned to leap off the boulder. "Pa!" Klein's feet stepped on the ground as he subconsciously looked back. Catalya remained sitting there hugging her knees. There wasn't anyone around, and the congealed sunset from the city opposite her shone over, producing a long shadow for her, blending with one of the shadows produced by withered trees. A gentle mountain breeze blew as the black figure gently shook. Catalya didn't move as she stubbornly waited on the spot. At such times, there's a need for a psychiatrist to interpret the dream's emotions. This has nothing to do with the revelations obtained from divination. Klein curled his lips and surveyed his surroundings to seek a direction in which to explore. He discovered that regardless of the direction he took, he would end up at the black buildings formed from the cloisters. There was a towering wall that isolated it from the cliff. No matter how the exploration was made, one had to pass by the cloister unless one jumped down the cliff. Since there was no other choice, Klein went directly to the pitch-black door of the cloister. The door was nearly 10 meters tall, and it didn't look like it was prepared for human use. Klein sized it up for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and extended his hands to push at the ends of the door. A creaking sound followed. The door's weight far exceeded Klein's imagination. His muscles bulged as his face flushed red. Yet, he was only able to move the door by a tiny bit without being able to push it open. Thankfully, it's only a dream. As long as there's reason to believe, I can raise my strength without truly activating creeping hunger. Klein exhaled and made his left glove be tainted with a paleness. In the midst of dark green sparkles, he obtained the strength of a zombie. His arm turned thicker as his leg swelled. Screech! A deep grinding sound boomed as the door slowly opened to reveal its interior. The two dark spires and the black buildings were connected by covered bridges as they surrounded a vast grayish rock square. There were plenty of holes in the square. Embedded in them were huge arrows. There were flaming stacks in various spots as if they had previously encountered an attack. Klein passed through the cave's entrance and entered the square. Unsurprisingly, he saw Frank Lee, Nina, Atolov, and company there. This is their dream? It doesn't seem so. Or should it be said that everyone's dream is limited to themselves? They will then be randomly placed somewhere in this world? Klein guessed without confidence. Frank Lee was the closest to him. He was holding a shovel and digging at some rubble. Beside him were the white bread, toast, and roasted fish which had previously fallen to the floor. He plans on using them as fertilizer? He's planning things even in his dreams. Klein went over and casually asked, "What are you doing?" Frank didn't stop, but he revealed a smile. "I'm cultivating some little things. They need to sleep in the soil for some time before they can grow big and proliferate." "What's their use?" Klein asked, both worried and curious. Frank beamed and said, "They're a crossbreed of fungus. It can make bulls produce milk. This way, we can obtain more milk, allowing more people to drink good milk." "Spare those bulls?" Klein's face twitched as he asked, "Will it succeed?" "There's no problems with the effects, but I'm very worried that they can't reproduce," Frank said with a frown. "May death forever favor them?" Klein prayed as he walked past Frank Lee and headed for the black building's entrance across the square. Along the way, he passed by Nina and navigator Atolov, who were drinking beside a collapsed pillar. Have you ever thought of leaving the pirate crew after you're older to find a man to marry and settle down? I don't think anyone wishes to drift out at sea their entire lives. Atolov took off his pointed bonnet and revealed his slightly hoary hair. His eyes and tone informed Klein that in between the lines, he meant, if you wish so, why not consider me? Mr. Navigator, you are old enough to be Nina's father. You need to consider your health. Passing by, Klein couldn't help but lampoon when he heard the conversation. Nina gulped a mouthful of beer and looked in a particular direction. No, that's not the life I wish to lead. Before joining you, I once attempted to settle down in the east coast of Fasak and not be a pirate again, but I was unable to bear with the boredom. I have to lug wood and move things every day, and I can only stay at home at night. I'm not allowed to go to the bar or go out hunting in the wilderness. Such a life seems constant and unchanging. Furthermore, I suffered all kinds of criticism, tolerating those irritating people. I have to worry about the cops even if I wish to beat them up. It's still better on the ship. Although it's boring most of the time, we can often go to different places and encounter different matters. Heh heh. Even the most boring times can wreck those fellows, training them into passable pirates. I can also tell them that the one who performs the best every month can spend the night in my room. Then, I'll watch them excitedly enjoy the torment. Of course, spending the night and having sex are different. It depends on my mood. A true female pirate. Everyone wishes for something different. Klein neutrally gave a comment and didn't believe that there was anything wrong with Nina's ideas. I won't disagree with her choice, but if she often kills, engages in arson, and plunders, I don't mind using her head to exchange for a bounty the next time we meet. Klein retracted his gaze and arrived at the suspected entrance of the black buildings and spires. Subconsciously, he turned his head and realized that the shadows in the corner seemed normal, but there was something different about it. Bloodless Heath Doyle? He hides in the shadows even in a dream? According to my limited knowledge of psychology, this is a result of greatly lacking a sense of security. Klein pushed another door which was similarly almost 10 meters tall. Amidst the grinding sounds, his gaze suddenly froze. Behind the door was a vast hall which had 2 rows of stone pillars supporting it. The hall was abnormally dark without any candlelight. As the main door opened, the light from outside shone in, lighting up the interior to make it clear. Klein saw that there were murals of various colors, with gold being the main color of choice on the dome. They were connected to one another without any gaps. It gave him a magnificent and sacred feeling. Thump, thump, thump. A figure had its back facing Klein, using the axe in its hand to chop at a long and huge tree. Its motives were unknown. The figure was dressed in a white shirt and a black vest. It didn't look like any of the pirates on the ship. There's someone else in these waters? Or could it be the mysterious pair of eyes that had been observing the deck and me? Klein's heart sank as he slowed down. He warily approached and came to the figure's side where he discerned the figure. It was a man who looked young. He had blonde short hair that was split 70-30. His emerald green eyes looked focused and serious. What are you doing? What is this place? Klein carefully asked. He intuitively believed that the person wasn't the owner of the mysterious eyes. The young man raised his hand to touch his earlobes without turning his head. Why are you asking these questions? My ship has sunk, and I'm busy making a canoe for myself. I don't have time to speak to you. Quote. Klein thought before asking, who are you? Who am I? I'm the unlucky Anderson. Ever since I saw that mural, I've been plagued with bad luck. The young man pointed in a direction. Tracing his finger, Klein saw a mural. The mural depicted a sea of fire that split in the middle to produce a path. On the path, there was a long line of people. The members either held their heads low with pious devotion or prostrated to the ground. Their destination was in the depths of the sea. Their leader was a lanky man with long silver hair. His facial features were mild and his eyes were tightly closed. On his back were layered wings. Klein's pupils constricted suddenly. He recognized the leader on the mural. It was the Angel of Fate which Little Sun had once depicted. It was the Tail Devourer, Ouroboros. After recognizing the leader on the mural, Klein subconsciously suspected that it was something from his dream. However, he quickly rejected the idea. This was because the unlucky Anderson wasn't someone he knew. He was also not someone that had left an impression on him. There was a low chance of him being the extension of his own dream. And Anderson had clearly said that he became unlucky after seeing the mural. It was strongly tied to the mural, so it could only be the case that the mural was part of Anderson's dream. As he focused and looked carefully, Klein quickly realized that the mural was somewhat different from the mural that Little Sun saw in the True Creator's abandoned temple. The background here was a sea burning with golden flames, while the previous one was that of a desolate plain. The destination here was the depths of the sea, while the previous one had a destination of a distant mountain. On the mountaintop was a huge cross and figure hanging upside down. The bottom of the Angel of Fate Ouroboros's feet was black slush with heads pointing down and fishes stuck inside. Previously, it was a meandering river. It's a different mural, but more of a memory from different stages of the same pilgrimage. Klein nodded with a guess. A similar scene surfaced in his mind. A very long time ago, in a particular period of the Fourth Epoch, Ouroboros led a devout group of pilgrims or the remnant believers of the true Creator. With many powerful enemies in pursuit, they rowed a boat through this sea. Due to certain reasons, he abandoned the boat. With the help of the true Creator or his own powers, he parted the sea and led the devotees through it and into the forsaken land of the gods, leaving behind the kindling for organizations such as the Rose Redemption and Aurora Order. In the forsaken land of the gods, they tore through desolate plains, and on the pilgrimage, they built temples along the way. And one of them was discovered by Little Sun and company. With Howell Ossepton was forced to restart a cycle and be reborn as a baby, the Tail Devourer is likely still alive. Does this mean that he eventually arrived at the destination with the pilgrims, the holy residence of the true Creator? Does this mean that the holy residence of the true Creator is somewhere in the forsaken land of the gods? With this in mind, Klein suddenly felt a baffling sense of wistfulness. If my theory is correct, then that means that no matter how the City of Silver tries to save itself, or how they continue passing the flame, once the true Creator completely awakens or is restored to his original state, they would unavoidably head towards destruction. When you are very close to the divine kingdom or holy residence of an evil god, your survival has nothing to do with your struggles. This is like the bubbles produced when sea waves surge to the shore. Once the waves recede, they would vanish. Human civilization and ethnic groups are just that weak under the gaze of an evil god. No, I can't be that pessimistic. I was only making a guess. Perhaps the one that forced Will Ossepton to reincarnate isn't Ouroboros. Perhaps the true Creator wouldn't recover or awaken that easily. He might be sealed by the 7 deities. Therefore, the City of Silver still has a chance. A path between the forsaken land of the gods and the external world needs to be forged before the evil god escapes from his shackles, allowing them to be moved out. This is probably why the chief of the City of Silver released Elder Shepherd. They need to use all the power they can get. Klein forcibly retracted his thoughts. He suddenly felt somewhat worried, afraid that his arrival was enough for him to be stuck in an endless cycle of fate created by the Tail Devourer. At this point, he instinctively wished to take 4 steps counterclockwise and go above the gray fog. He wanted to forcibly search for memories that he might have lost, but ultimately, he resisted those actions and prepared to observe first. From his interpretation of the symbols, there were no repeating rivers. There was only a black slush with fish embedded inside. It didn't mean the existence of a circle of fate, only the lingering of bad luck. This was identical to what Anderson said. As a king of angels, Ouroboros definitely has more than a cycle of fate. Different temples have different murals, and them using different powers is completely logical. Besides, this is a dream. Besides, even if I didn't do anything and really am stuck in a repeated cycle, making me repeatedly converse with the Admiral of Stars, to the point of making my observations, the problem will be resolved once Monday comes. The Tarot Club will definitely not be held. Miss Justice and the others will definitely feel puzzled as they make a prayer, and I'll use it to regain my memories. Klein instantly felt confident as the chaos and tension in his heart was buried instead of disappearing. He looked up ahead and discovered that the hall went further in. There was no end to it, and there was light shining inside. However, it was restricted to the entrance. The other areas were dark and only became darker the deeper it was. All that could be seen were the wooden doors on both sides, their destinations were unknown. Upon seeing this dark and creepy scene, Klein's desire to continue exploring was minimized. To encounter a mural left behind by a king of angels here, who knows what will happen if I delve deeper or enter some room. The fear of the unknown was an extremely ancient feeling. A premonition of danger with unknown origins had brought about a strong terror towards the unknown. Klein observed himself for a few seconds before he stopped proceeding forward. He turned towards Anderson, who was chopping the gigantic tree. "Why are you here?" Anderson looked up and scoffed. "I'm a treasure hunter. So tell me, why would I be here?" Treasure hunter. Klein casually asked, there's treasure here? Anderson continued busying himself with the creation of the so-called canoe. His voice suddenly turned deep. There are treasures everywhere in these waters. As long as you obtain it successfully and leave alive. That's true. But the problem is that it's very dangerous if one isn't a demigod, but it's even more dangerous for a demigod to be here. Klein looked into the hall's depths and asked, do you know where this place is? Anderson traced his gaze and said, I don't know. At least a third of my companions formed a team and headed in to explore. But they never returned. Are you referring to the real world or the dream world? Klein asked with a clear line of thought. Bang! After the axe landed, Anderson laughed. Of course it's in the real world. The ones that proceeded to explore the dream are the other third of my companions. They similarly didn't return. Quote. Klein inhaled as he thought. Where are their bodies in the real world? They have mutated into monsters. They killed off quite a number of my companions. Anderson raised his axe and cleaved down. Clang! Amidst a crisp sound, his axe broke into two. As the crack was towards the back, the fragment immediately shot at him. Anderson's right chest and abdomen immediately bled like a spewing fountain. He held his left hand to his wound and looked up at Klein. Smiling bitterly, he said, I told you I was plagued with bad luck ever since I saw that mural. Thankfully, this isn't considered too unlucky. At the very least, they didn't destroy my ordinarily handsome face. Ellipsis. Are such descriptive terms supposed to be used that way? Klein looked at Anderson quickly pull out the fragments from his body as he handled the wound and consumed some medicine. He discovered that Anderson was unfazed, and the skill involved in his actions meant that he had already gotten accustomed to it. Klein had a single hand in his pocket as he played with the coins in it. After some deliberation, he asked, when your companions began the exploration, were you part of the group that stayed behind to study the mural? Anderson was taken aback as he inserted his medicine bag into his belt and wiped his mouth. No, I was part of the group that did the exploration. As he spoke, he grinned and revealed a genial smile. Klein's pupils constricted as he bent his back slightly and raised his left palm. At this moment, blinding sunlight illuminated everything in a dazzling white. Then, it dimmed and vanished. Klein naturally opened his eyes and discovered that the outside had been restored to the midday state. He took out the pocket watch in his inner pocket and opened it. Only half an hour passed. This night is rather short. That unlucky Anderson looked very normal, but who knew that he was that terrifying? Rolling to his feet, Klein suddenly recalled something. Snake of Fate Will Osepton had yet to reply to him. As everyone's dream had been pulled into the world without the connection of the spirit world, he was unable to locate me? Or did he sense Ouroboros's aura and didn't dare come close? Or could there be something problematic with these waters to begin with? As his thoughts whirled, Klein decided to verify it. As for how it could be verified, the method was simple. He could sleep again while it was still noon. However, he wasn't in a rush to do so. This was because he wasn't sure if there were any taboos about sleeping in the day. Wearing his cap, Klein came outside the captain's cabin and knocked on the door. After 3 knocks, he retracted his hand and patiently waited. Before long, Catalya opened the door. She no longer looked as lost as she was in the dream. She had worn her heavy glasses once again. Is sleeping in the day all right? Klein asked directly. Catalya nodded. Yes. After answering, she hesitated and asked, it seems you were very proactive in that dream? Realizing how much danger lurked in these waters, and thinking about how he would be forced to show some of his abilities, Klein decided to proactively lay the foundations of his future explanations. He looked at Catalya and smiled politely. Yes. This is a gift bestowed upon me by my lord. My lord. Under Catalya's thick glasses, her eyes clearly shimmered. In a rare instance, she frowned slightly and eased them without asking any more questions. Klein thought for a moment, then he added, be careful of Heath Doyle. Catalya clearly understood what he meant and directly answered, don't worry. He has a sealed artifact which has a negative effect of him only being able to hear voices from nearby. That's a smart use of a negative effect. Klein didn't drone on as he took off his hat and bowed before returning to his room. He lay down once again and used cogitation to fall asleep. In the dream world, he woke up and saw the familiar pitch-black plains and black steeple. Phew, it's still possible to connect. Klein heaved a sigh of relief and traveled into the steeple. In the usual place, he saw the scattered tarot cards and the new words. There's plenty of dangers there, the most dangerous being the dream that happens when night falls. It isn't about the disappearances if you do not sleep, but there's one thing to remember. Do not explore that dream. Absolutely do not explore that dream. Since there's not enough space, I won't explain why. Alright, it's just a joke. The reason is that the area contains some of the dreams left behind by a deity. Upon seeing Will Ossepton's warning, Kleins first found himself blessed with good luck. Thankfully I didn't court death and continue the exploration. He didn't hesitate to heave a sigh of relief. Although he had seen the mural related to Ouroboros, as well as the terrifying monster, Anderson, who mutated for some unknown reason, he didn't actually physically get himself into a dangerous situation. I wonder if I'll randomly appear in a region in the next dream, or will it continue from before? If it's the latter, the best choice of action is to not disturb Anderson so as to avoid agitating him. I'll just walk the same way back and leave that black cloister. Klein retracted his gaze and continued reading. Apart from the dream, the other things aren't that troublesome. As long as you don't attempt to approach those ruins, directly look at the thing that flies in the sky at midday, or challenge the storms that give ample warning, then it wouldn't be a problem if you follow the safe sea routes that have been verified by others. As for mermaids, just keep cruising forward and you'll ultimately encounter them. This is because, at their levels, they will only live in relatively safer areas, and there aren't many such areas. Finally, I hope everything goes smoothly. Sincerely, your friend who might be often in deep sleep due to reaching a critical stage in his maturing development, Will Ossepton. The final sentence was long and somewhat awkward sounding, but Klein instantly understood what the snake of fate meant. Before I'm born, don't disturb me unless it's something extremely important and critical. I'll try my best, Klein replied inwardly without any assurance. If he successfully advanced, then it might not take long before he had to seek Will Ossepton's help in finding the Sequence 4 potion formula for the Seer pathway. Being more confident with finding mermaids, Klein immediately left the dream, wore his hat, and headed for the pirates' dining hall. Due to the dream's disturbance, most of the food had turned cold, but the pirates still had a great time eating. After all, no one died. Since no one died during this mystical encounter, they naturally felt great that they had something to brag about. Do you want a cup of milk? Frank Lee held a plate and sat opposite Klein, asking warmly. Recalling the conversation in the dream, Klein firmly shook his head with a deadpan expression. Inwardly, he was very worried that the milk on the ship were all Frank's experimental products. Frank didn't mind as he gulped a mouthful of milk. I remember telling you about those little things in the dream? Yes. Klein cut through a dragonbone fish that was cooked in sauce, and he stuffed it into his mouth. This kind of fish was well known for having few bones. Most of the time, it only had one main bone. In Backland, due to its various species, they were considered a mid to high-end delicacy, but east of the Oravi Island, in the periphery of the safe sea routes, they could often be caught. Frank chuckled. My description back then was a little inaccurate. Their true purpose was to successfully produce milk even when they aren't in a state capable of lactation, regardless of whether they are male or female. As long as they consume it, they will produce milk and return to normal once they aren't fed. This way, the milk cows don't have to suffer any torture. This way, it becomes fairer for men and women to bring up their children. It will be beneficial for women to head out for work. Wait, why are you telling me this? Klein nearly failed to maintain his persona as Gehrman Sparrow. At that instant, he felt that the nickname of Crazy shouldn't be Gehrman Sparrow's but Frank Lee's. He's actually someone who supports equality between men and women. However, his means are a little terrifying. That's right. The Church of Mother Earth is like the Church of the Goddess. They believe that women should have the same standing in society as men. However, they place more emphasis on reproduction, treating it as the holiest matter. Among the 7 churches, the Church of Storms and the Church of the God of Combat are most biased towards men. The Church of the Sun is next. As for the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, they are different from the other churches. They discriminate based on intelligence. The Church of Steam is neutral and has even worked with the Church of the Goddess to encourage women to head out for work due to the need for more labor in the development of industry. Klein instantly had the differences between the 7 churches flash past his mind. He looked up and glanced at Frank Lee as though what he had just said was something trivial. This made Frank rather happy as he couldn't help but drink a few more mouthfuls of milk. After the pirates finished their lunch in batches, Catalya pushed open the windows to the captain's cabin once again. Using magic, she amplified her voice. There's an island 1.5 nautical miles ahead of us. We will dock there and wait for the storm to pass. In these waters, every time there's a switch from noon to nighttime, there's a possibility of a terrifying storm occurring. I cannot confirm when it will happen, but I believe it's safer for us to wait for it to pass before we continue our voyage. She went into the details a lot more than in the past, as it wasn't a sudden occurrence, and there was plenty of time. One of the things people at sea feared the most was a storm. Therefore, no one objected to it. They went according to Catalya's instructions. Under Navigator Atolov's and Bosun Nina's guidance, they nervously prepared to dock. And this made Klein confirm one of the matters that Will Ossepton had mentioned. Do not challenge any signs of a storm. Before long, an island covered with gigantic trees appeared ahead of the future. The more than 100-meter-long sailboat adjusted its course and docked against the wind. More than half an hour passed as the sky suddenly dimmed. Lead-colored clouds surfaced one after another. They overlapped with one another as though they enveloped all the surrounding waters. Amidst a loud boom and blinding flashes of lightning, a hurricane from afar swept over. It was connected to the clouds at the top and to the sea at the bottom. It was more exaggerated than any legendary giant. It was like a gigantic coiling serpent in a bid to destroy the world. The terrifying hurricane brought with it waves that towered like mountains. Lightning that branched out like trees and didn't stop because of the incoming storm. It constantly struck the surface of the sea, splitting into tiny electric bolts that spread outwards. As the rain pattered down on the Future's deck, it made the pirates who had entered the cabin or gotten shelter feel like the apocalypse had arrived. Such a storm didn't last too long. The sea calmed down after about 15 minutes, and the hurricane dissipated. The midday sunlight reigned in the sky once again. You can head onto the island for a while, but don't wander inside. You have to be within the range of the cannons. Catalya gave the pirates a brief chance of reprieve. Klein kept in mind Will Ossepton's warnings and had no desire to explore the island. After leaving the Future, he only walked about on the shore, taking in the feeling of having his feet on solid ground. Beach, sunlight, trees. It feels like a vacation. Klein thought in amusement when he suddenly noticed a rapidly moving black dot through the corner of his eye. It was rushing over from the boundary of a cliff. The black dot increased in size to reveal a human figure. Not far away, Catalya, who was on the sand, also noticed the abnormality. She half turned around and took off the heavy glasses on her nose bridge. The figure with emerald-colored eyes approached. He was wearing a white shirt, a black vest, and trousers. He was of medium build with his blonde hair split 70-30. Anderson. The unlucky Anderson. Klein instantly recognized him. The person was none other than the terrifying Anderson in the dream world. It was the Anderson who said that his companions never returned after they proceeded to explore the hall but had claimed to be a member of the exploration team. At that moment, Anderson raised his right hand. Without any hesitation, as Gehrman Sparrow, Klein took out a charm and chanted a single word in ancient Hermes. Storm. The charm made of tin immediately turned sharp, resembling a thin blade. With the infusion of spirituality, the wind in mid-air reverberated. With a deadpan expression, Klein threw out the charm in his hand at Anderson. Sue, Sue, Sue. Azure sharp blades shot at their target like a lined-up firing squad. Anderson was raising his right hand high with a smile and was about to say something when he heard a deep and mysterious incantation and the scalp-numbing sound of the wind. His gaze froze as he threw himself to the side and somersaulted multiple times in a pathetic manner as if the area before him was scorching metal. Sue, Sue, Sue. The wind blades struck the beach, slicing clear slits into the sand, but they were just short of hitting their target. Stop, stop. As Anderson nimbly somersaulted to dodge, he shouted, I come in peace. I mean no harm. Anderson Hood, Admiral of Stars, suddenly said a name as she raised her hand to stop Gehrman Sparrow, who had taken out a charm. She knows Anderson? Klein didn't rashly chant the charm's incantation as he said in a deep voice, he has already mutated. I saw him in the dream. He wasn't surprised at meeting the unlucky Anderson. This was because the pirates were all in the same area during the dream. They were all very close to one another, which also meant that Anderson, who wasn't too far away, was also very close to the future. No, not at all. Anderson stood up, at a loss on whether to laugh or cry. He raised his hands like he was surrendering. I recognize you. You asked me many questions. Back then, I wanted to pull a prank on you. Really, it was just a joke to enliven the mood. Don't you think that having the mood suddenly change into one of horror is an exhilarating experience? Of course, I'm referring to the target and not myself. If I had participated in the exploration, how could I still be alive? That is what I'm worried about. Klein didn't believe his explanation. Anderson shrugged and said, I was preparing to explain that the moment I said that. I was planning on telling you that I was joking and had planned to seek your help. I hoped that you could take me away, but at that moment, the dream ended. Damn it, I was really too unlucky. It does comply with the traits of being unlucky. Klein silently muttered. He planned on flipping a coin right there and then to test him with divination when he suddenly heard Admiral of Stars Catalya say, listen to what he has to say. He's very famous in the Fog Sea. He has the nickname, Strongest Hunter. Strongest Hunter. Klein was shocked by this nickname. After carefully recalling, he realized that the man didn't have a bounty on his head. That meant that Anderson Hood's description of himself in the dream world was real and reliable. He was more of a treasure hunter. Unfortunately, Gehrman Sparrow hasn't killed any pirate admirals, otherwise, I would be the strongest hunter. Klein didn't let down his guard as he coldly looked at the man. As long as Anderson Hood showed any signs of abnormality, he would immediately throw the charm in his hand. After all, the activation incantation was all the same. At his sequence, he could do it simultaneously while injecting his spirituality. Upon hearing the Admiral of Stars's introduction, Anderson seriously shook his head. No, I'm not the strongest hunter. Oh, he's still rather humble. Klein sighed inwardly. Anderson chuckled and added, Admiral of Stars, if you really insist, then it's best if you add the condition, below that of a demigod. Yes, the strongest hunter below that of a demigod. Ellipsis. I take back what I just said. The corners of Klein's mouth twitched indiscernibly. Seeing no response from the Admiral of Stars, Anderson naturally lowered his arms. These waters are very dangerous, but it contains many treasures. In this regard, I believe the two of you are very aware. In the past, many adventurers, or more precisely, treasure hunters, have entered these waters to seek our fortuitous encounters, but most of them didn't leave these waters alive. Heh heh, I'm talking about most, so there are always some lucky ones who can obtain items and ingredients while successfully leaving. The treasure hunting team I was in was organized by two treasure hunters who are experienced in this area. They claim to be very aware of which ruins are not to be explored in the first half of the safe route and which ruins could be attempted. They also claim to know which methods should be used to hunt various kinds of monsters, as well as what methods should be used to avoid evil creatures who have lost control. I've always been curious about these waters and was successfully convinced by them and joined the expedition. And then? Catalya looked at the figure opposite her with her black eyes that had a purple hue. Anderson sighed and said, it was very smooth in the beginning, as smooth as it can be. We avoided danger and obtained many of the relics left behind by former explorers, and we also hunted some monsters and obtained several ingredients. Everything changed when we discovered a strange temple on a submerged island. There were many murals which remained intact. This gentleman has also seen it in the dream world. He used his chin to gesture at Klein. That's not important, Klein replied calmly. Anderson shook his head and smiled bitterly. One of the murals was very sinister. It described a pilgrimage proceeding forward amidst a parted sea. The leader of the pilgrimage is depicted as an angel, having long silver hair that reached his back. He had very mild facial features. I was the first to arrive in front of that mural. I reached out my right hand and habitually outlined the various lines in midair. It's true, I really didn't touch it. I was at least 5 centimeters away, but to my surprise, the angel in the mural suddenly opened his eyes. Ellipsis. Your nickname as the strongest hunter must have been forced as a result of you attracting too many problems. Klein scoffed silently without any sense of pity. Silver-haired angel? Catalya asked in return. Yes, but I'm not sure which angel it is. At the very least, he hasn't appeared in any of the portraits of the 7 churches. Of course, the mural artist might have casually added it, and it might not be real. Anderson was just about to raise his hand to comb his hair when he discovered that the man wearing a round neck shirt, a brown jacket, pantaloons with a dark-colored cap was coldly staring at him. It appeared as though any abnormal action would result in the man attacking without hesitation. But at that moment, Klein was thinking about something else. This fellow is very professional when it comes to art. At the very least, the typical person wouldn't be able to know of so many religious portraits. Catalya, who didn't receive an adequate answer, immediately turned her head towards Klein, her gaze filled with an inquisitive look. She had just heard from Anderson Hood that Gehrman Sparrow had seen the mural. Perhaps this member of the organization that has been gifted by the Lord can recognize the angel. Catalya had an inexplicable feeling that Gehrman Sparrow might really know the answer. Considering how Ma'am Hermit would be able to obtain the answer at the next tarot club from a casual question, Klein didn't hesitate to simply say, Tail Devourer Ouroboros. Tail Devourer Ouroboros? That angel of fate? That king of angels? Catalya unknowingly pursed her lips as the purple hue in her eyes turned slightly more obvious. The last time she had heard this name was from the Tarot Club, thanks to Miss Justice. And that was her first time learning of the existence of the kings of angels. She never expected to obtain clues of them in the real world in just a few months. Tail Devourer Ouroboros? Anderson ruminated over the name in a daze. Klein didn't speak further, showing his disinterest in explaining. Seeing how the Admiral of Stars wasn't speaking a word, Anderson could only laugh and continue. I thought I was hallucinating back then because the mural didn't show any abnormality after that. Following that, our team fractured into two. Most of them were frightened by my account and believed that they shouldn't continue exploring the temple. The remaining third desired to obtain more treasure and began setting off deeper into the temple. We waited an entire day, noon switched night a total of 3 times, but we didn't manage to see them return. We were all outstanding treasure hunters, so we knew that something must have gone wrong. After making some confirmations, we didn't dare stay any longer or wait. We immediately left the temple and got onto the ship to return the way we came. We had already received plenty, and we didn't wish to take any more risks. Wait, none of you had the intention to save your companions? Yes, a treasure hunting team that is temporarily put together will only bother with themselves and the few friends they are familiar with when they encounter danger. According to my experience, those companions of yours that vanished might be eating the fingers of corpses. Klein lampooned and didn't reprimand Anderson. Anderson sighed again and said, after leaving that temple, I discovered that there was something abnormal about myself. On the one hand, I became very unlucky, with everything I do failing. Even when drinking light beer in silence, I'll realize that someone had used a beer barrel as a toilet and pissed in it. Well, that's not what I encountered. It was my companion. On the other hand, we obtained control of ourselves in our dreams. We were no longer in a reverie and knew something, but we had no means to take action. Therefore, a number of my companions, a third of the original number of people, ventured deep into the dream world. They never returned. Catalya, who had been listening in silence, asked, what about their bodies in the real world? They mutated into monsters, killing quite a number of my remaining companions and sailors. Anderson took an obvious deep breath. We might have successfully killed those monsters, but due to the lack of sailors, as well as encountering a streak of bad luck, we failed to reach this island in time before the storm arrived. Therefore, our ship sank. Likewise for our loot. The rest of my companions either drowned, got struck by lightning, or got eaten by the underwater monsters. I didn't see all of it myself. As for me, I was relatively stronger and luckier than them. I was sent flying by the waves and successfully swam to the shore of this island and began attempting to create a canoe to leave this area. Hey, as you can see, even my final axe has shattered. It was also reflected in the dream. Anderson's final sentences were directed at Klein. They really are a treasure hunting group plagued with bad luck. Klein inwardly drew the crimson moon for him. He believed that Anderson's description was likely real. His experience didn't seem to be fabricated out of thin air. However, it was unknown if he was hiding something. Perhaps Anderson had really gone deep into the temple and eaten the fingers of the corpses before coming out, believing that he was fine. Perhaps he had already explored numerous places in the dream world and had been corrupted by some unknown creature in an inconspicuous manner. After Anderson Hood finished recounting his experience, he smiled at Catalya and the man who he didn't know the name of. Do I have the honor of being a passenger on your future? I will pay for the fare. He looked as if payment wasn't a problem at all. Catalya once again turned her head to the side towards Klein, as though asking if he would accept. This is to say that you are leaning towards accepting his request? Aren't you going to do any tests? I have to go above the gray fog to divine before I can provide a clear answer. What gives you the confidence? A Beyonder power obtained once a mystery prior reaches sequence 5? Klein figured out a lot of information from Catalya's gaze. Just as he was hesitating, Anderson hurriedly said, I'm very familiar with the route ahead. I can help you avoid the latent dangers on the safe sea route, and I can tell you which ruins aren't to be explored. I can also give you early notice to avoid the singing voices of the mermaids in time. Singing voices of mermaids? Klein's eyes nearly lit up as it took him a great deal of effort to maintain Gehrman Sparrow's image. Yes, a day's voyage from here, and I mean a day in terms of the world outside, we will circle around a ruin and turn. Upon saying that, Anderson suddenly realized something as he shut his mouth with a smile without saying anything more. Klein thought for a moment and took out a gold coin in front of Anderson as he silently chanted. Anderson Hood is problematic. Ellipsis. He repeated 7 times and went through the standard process of divination, but he didn't hold any hopes for an answer. It was a test on Anderson. If Anderson really was problematic, he would definitely show signs of guilt. After all, he couldn't be certain of Gehrman Sparrow's divination standard and was unable to determine if he could disrupt it successfully. Ding! The gold coin was flung into the air before landing. Klein glanced at it before putting it into his pocket. No problem. I'll later make a confirmation by going above the gray fog. Klein added inwardly. Catalya looked at Anderson and nodded. I agree to your request. However, after we leave these waters, you need to hand over half of what you have. If there's nothing, I'll not take anything either. Anderson fell silent for a few seconds before smiling again. Deal. Having found a way out, he clearly relaxed as he smiled. Also, I have to warn you that although my bad luck is limited to me alone, you should be careful because I might attract monsters. Of course, I believe that with you, this gentleman, and myself, we should be able to guarantee our safety. Just as he said that, the entire island quaked. A smoky plume emanated out of the primitive forest. Don't tell me a monster is really coming. Anderson subconsciously turned agape. The ground trembled slightly as a figure that was nearly 3 meters tall appeared at the boundary of the island's primitive forest. Its body was grayish-white in color, seemingly formed from boulders. Its face was potholed without any obvious eyes, nose, mouth, or ears. Stone giant. Catalya muttered the monster's type. Be it Klein or Anderson, both of them knew nothing about such monsters. However, they didn't cast an inquisitive look at Catalya. They focused on the monster, looking highly professional. Catalya turned her body to face the docked future. She raised her right hand halfway and amplified her voice. Aim. The pirates on duty immediately adjusted dozens of cannons on the port of the ship, aiming them right at the stone giant which was lumbering over. Boom! 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 Cannonballs flew out and landed around the stone giant, sending dust flying as the bombardment covered a huge area. The ground clearly quaked as flames surged. Splinters spewed everywhere as though everything could be destroyed. Tap! 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 The tall grayish-white figure tore out of the dust, having not suffered any serious damage. All it had were a few cracks on its surface. Catalya said without a perturbed expression, this isn't a kind of giant, but a kind of stone golem. Its core is the main ingredient of Sequence 5 Guardian from the Guardian sequence pathway. Therefore, its defenses are extremely high. Amidst the reverberating cannon bombardment, Klein nearly suspected if there was a problem with his auditory senses. Since you know that the stone giant has high defense, why did you use a cannon bombardment? Isn't that a waste of cannonballs? He thought in puzzlement as he lampooned. Perhaps hearing his inner thoughts, Catalya said as she watched the stone giant approach, I've never encountered such a Beyonder creature before, so I wish to do some tests. I have nothing to say against such a reason. Klein was rendered speechless. At this moment, Anderson Hood, who had been observing the stone giant the entire time, raised his hand and said, Do you have anyone who has Beyonder powers in the ice and frost domain? Me, Catalya coldly answered. Seeing how Ma'am Hermit had the means, Klein swallowed back the words he nearly said out loud. He really didn't wish to activate creeping hunger unless necessary, despite Zombie possessing the powers of ice and frost. He believed that he couldn't find any suitable food on the island. Catalya took out a grayish-black scroll from a secret pocket in her warlock robe and softly chanted a single word in ancient Hermes, freezing. Silently, the scroll was consumed by icy blue flames and immediately, there were crystalline streams of light that appeared in mid-air. They flew towards the stone giant and froze the target within as icicles hung from it. Amidst jarring, cracking sounds, the ice layer cracked in turn as the stone giant slowly walked out of the zone. However, its grayish-white exterior had turned a darker shade. Its motions were a lot stiffer than before. At this moment, Anderson raised his hands as though he was a conductor gesturing for the audience to give their applause. Orange-yellow flames which were almost white in color sprouted at the stone giant's feet as though it had stepped into a particular trap. Its surface rapidly produced a bout of steam as cracks spread across its body in the form of deep fractures. Anderson pulled back with his right arm as a burning white spear condensed in his palm. The flames at the tip of the spear condensed to a point as it emitted a blinding luster. The spear flew out, accurately hitting the crack in the stone giant's belly as the flames melted a huge hole in it. As for Anderson Hood, who was originally on the beach, he seemed to merge with the burning white spear. The flames brightened as he strangely appeared behind the stone giant. He held his left hand into a fist as his arm bulged. With an uppercut, he struck upwards from the hole and into the stone giant's heart. This simple-looking strike created an exaggerated effect. The stone giant immediately froze on the spot as cracking sounds constantly emitted from its interior. In seconds, it had crumbled into rubble. A critical strike. Klein's pupils constricted. Catalya calmly stood on the spot and said without any surprise, "Sequence 5 of the hunter pathway is Reaper. Furthermore, they are good at finding the weakness of their prey." Reaper? A death reaper of life? No wonder. Klein nodded slightly. At this moment, Anderson crouched down and rummaged through the stone giant's carcass. Then, he turned his head and smiled ruefully. "It's not a real monster." That meant that there weren't any spoils of war. While Anderson described the situation, the rubble vanished at a discernible pace. "For an unlucky fellow like you, don't be the one opening chests or looting corpses." Klein couldn't help but lampoon inwardly. Anderson returned and kept droning on. "The greatest problem of these waters is this. Not every monster will provide you with riches. This is because conjured monsters such as this are a part of more powerful monsters of a higher level. Of course, it's possible that they're the result of remnant powers and auras." Klein already had a preliminary theory towards this. Having gone through the voyage, he discovered that there were beyonder traces of Sun, Evernight, Storm, and the Spectator pathway. He had a more fleshed-out theory from his previous theories. He originally suspected that these waters were the remnants of a battlefield in a war between Second Epic ancient gods. Storm belonged to Elf King Soniathrum. Spectator belonged to Dragon King Ancualt. Evernight belonged to King of Demonic Wolves Phlegria. With Little Sun providing him with the legendary records from the City of Silver at each gathering, Klein had gained a preliminary understanding of the authorities of the 8 ancient gods in the Second Epic. However, the constant midday and the sun chariot formed from gold had made Klein have doubts about his theory. This was because none of the 8 ancient gods grasped the sun pathway. Soon, Klein connected it to Amon's and Adam's father, the City of Silver creator who was deemed as the ancient sun god. After this creator awakened, and after a series of intense battles, he had taken back the authorities of the ancient gods. Hence, these ruins of the battle between gods were left behind. The incomplete mural he saw at the Elvish ruin suddenly surfaced in Klein's mind. Elf King Soniathrum and the City of Silver's creator, who was also the ancient sun god, were at odds. As his thoughts wandered, Anderson had returned to his chuckling state. He looked at him and said, "How do I address you?" "Gehrman Sparrow." Klein simply gave his name. "Gehrman Sparrow?" Anderson was first taken aback before recovering. "I've heard of you. You're the adventurer who nearly successfully hunted Vice Admiral Ailment. You have the title of the craziest hunter. Last month, when the ship I was on board passed by the Rorstad Archipelago and Oravi Island, I had thoughts of getting to know you over drinks, but your whereabouts were unknown." "Last month? I was doing volunteer work at the hospital." Klein nodded and said, "You know me now. Also, try your best not to say anything." Anderson forced a smile. "I know, my bad luck tends to make the negative words I say become reality." "All right, stop looking at me. I won't speak again. Put down that charm of yours." Due to the appearance of the stone giant, the pirate's relaxation time was cut short. The Future quickly set off once again, venturing deep into the sea. Along the way, Klein stayed standing on the deck and leaned against the side of the ship. He observed his surroundings while Anderson was loitering on the ship. He was good at socializing and interacting with the pirates. Impressive. He easily got to know the situation of the ship. Klein shot a glance at Anderson, who was drinking with a few pirates in the shadows, as he sighed inwardly. Of course, the strongest hunter probably doesn't know that the alcohol he's drinking has a sedative of unknown origins. Klein held back his laughter as he thought mischievously. With Anderson's help, the Future circled around 2 hidden maelstroms and a floating palace ruin as it continued down the safe sea route. About 3 hours later, night fell again. Klein rapidly found his lucidity and reason in the dream as he opened his eyes and looked around. His vision was a swath of pitch blackness with nothing to be seen. "Don't tell me I'm blind." Such a thought instinctively appeared in Klein's mind. Then, he reached his right palm into his pocket and took out a matchstick. This was a component that every magician needed for his spells. With familiarity, he took out a matchstick and ignited it. Immediately, a weak flame appeared in front of Klein's eyes. The flame struggled as it bloomed, slightly illuminating his surroundings. He was in a prison cell, one with an unlatched gate made up of metal railings. Why would I be here? I'm neither beside Admiral of Stars or in the mural hall where Anderson was. I'm randomly placed in a particular area? As his thoughts raced, Klein flicked his wrist and extinguished the matchstick that nearly burnt his fingers. A resplendent layer of sunlight bloomed on his left hand as his eyes had two miniaturized suns. With the soul of the priest of light, he obtained night vision from the light of holiness. As he observed his surroundings, Klein saw that the cell he was in wasn't too cramped, but the floor was dirty and messy. There were many footprints, a mystery as to what previously happened. Most of them are human footprints. A few of them are rather exaggerated, likely belonging to giants. The single bed is broken in the corner while there's a key beside the door. Someone succeeded in a jailbreak? Klein came before the unlocked metal gate and carefully looked outside. The prison was filled with darkness. The darkness enveloped a stone-paved corridor, and across from him was a cold but solid wall. The path extended continuously on both sides as though there were more prison cells. Klein retracted his gaze, picked up the key on the ground, and locked the gates. He didn't attempt to head out and continued staying in the cell. He clearly remembered that Will Ossepton had advised him not to explore the dream world. Therefore, he planned on awaiting the arrival of noon. So what if it's a prison cell? It's not like I'm leaving. Klein huddled in the corner, sitting on the halved single bed, seemingly blending with the rich darkness around him. In this extreme silence, Klein suddenly cocked his head since he vaguely heard light footsteps. The sound of footsteps came from afar in an ethereal manner and at a slow frequency as it approached him. No way. I haven't gone anywhere. Has the far-reaching hands of trouble come on its own? Klein revealed a grimace that didn't match Gehrman Sparrow's persona. He nearly drew a gasp. The only thing stopping him from doing that was because it would cause quite a stir, making trouble discover his hiding spot. No longer a green nighthawk, he rapidly made up his mind. He held his breath, slowly stood up, and moved to the side of the metal gate, without a sound. He secretly and silently looked in the direction of the incoming footsteps. He believed that, since hiding and avoiding it wasn't necessarily useful, he had to determine the danger revolving around the situation so as to make the best choice. The two miniature suns in his eyes dimmed as Klein waited for nearly a minute as he heard the footsteps turn heavier and clearer. Following that, he heard the clanking sound of a metallic gate slamming into the wall. Following that, he saw a towering figure appear on the right of the corridor. The figure was nearly 2.5 meters tall and wore black, full-body armor. The cold feeling it exuded seemed corporeal like a gigantic knight. His aura was converged, and he was stayed like the deep sea. In the space where his eyes were, there were two deep red glows that flickered. In his hand was a long and broad black sword. Creak. He pushed open the metal gate to a cell and stepped in. He circled the cell, seemingly in search of something. Man, is he trying to find a particular prisoner? I'll definitely be discovered if this continues. Klein hesitated for a moment and wondered if he should leave the cell and search for a way out before the figure came close, or to sneak an attack to finish the target in a clean swoop before continuing to huddle in a corner to await the end of the dream. After judging how much time he had left to think, Klein quickly took off the topaz pendant on his left wrist and began divining with a voice that perhaps only he could hear. That night from before is very strong. After quickly repeating it 7 times, Klein opened his eyes to see the topaz pendant turning clockwise at a high frequency and large amplitudes. This meant that the target was an extremely dangerous existence. Without any hesitation or time to hesitate, Klein used the Beyonder powers of a clown and controlled his muscles to pull open the metal gates without causing any additional stimulation. Then, he took the opportunity when the black armored entity entered another cell, to gently walk out into the corridor and rapidly headed left with his body crouched. In the immense darkness, as he listened for any commotion behind him, he maintained his stealthy and swift motions, quickly making a bend and arriving at a metal gate which opened outwards. It looked like an exit. Attempting to push and pull, Klein discovered that the metal gates weren't heavy, but it had been locked. After 2 seconds of thought, he took out the key he picked up inside his cell, inserted it, and twisted it without holding out much hope. A light click of a latch opening sounded as the metal gates unlocked. That works? Although it's a dream, you can't just have a randomly picked up key be an important item. I originally planned on folding some paper to insert into the keyhole and repeatedly slice at it, bit by bit. Klein slowly pushed open the door as he lampooned while thinking in puzzlement. To his disappointment, what stood behind the metal gates wasn't the exit but a hall filled with junk. Closing the gate behind him in passing, he locked it again and circled around the items randomly strewn around, in search of a possible door or path. A few seconds later, he noticed an inconspicuous black wooden door in a corner. Therefore, he carefully approached it and reached out for the handle. The scene inside naturally appeared in his mind. It was a storage room, and on the right was a full body mirror. And to its right was a figure wearing a short linen robe. There's someone there? The escaped prisoner? Having been forced to leave his comfort zone, Klein decided to take hold of the initiative in a limited fashion. Therefore, he gently twisted the handle and pushed open the black wooden door. He wanted to gather information on the general situation, so as to determine where to engage in combat or flee at the critical moment in time. Who is it? The figure wearing a short linen robe hurriedly but softly asked. Its voice was filled with despair and pain. An adventurer, Klein succinctly answered. He had already used his night vision to discern the figure's looks. It was a man with a weathered face. He had wrinkles on his forehead and the corners of his eyes and mouth, but his hair was raven black and lustrous. There wasn't a single strand of gray hair. His short linen robe was ancient and simple. His expression was distorted due to the pain. His rarely seen pure black eyes were filled with unconcealed surprise and puzzlement. Adventurer? Why would you be here? Klein maintained a certain distance from the man who was difficult to discern whether he was considered young or old. He stood by the entrance and looked at him. Before asking others, introducing yourself is a necessary form of politeness. As a faceless, just the short act of sizing him up from before had made him grasp the man's features. Apart from the discordant hair and the wrinkles, he had an old, gruesome scar on his cheek. The man was startled as he worriedly glanced at the hall. It's best you close the door. We cannot be caught by that devil, otherwise. The muscles on his face clearly twitched as though he had recalled something nasty. Devil? Klein murmured and extended his hand back to close the black wooden door. The man heaved a sigh of relief and smiled wryly. I apologize. I was indeed impolite. My name is Leomaster, an ascetic of a religious organization. A religious organization? From the looks of it, you aren't a devotee of any of the 7 deities. Klein discovered a problem with his choice of words. If he was an ascetic of one of the 7 deities, he could have directly said it out loud. Even the high priest of the Church of Sun and the bishops of the Church of Storms wouldn't come to blows the moment they met in such a dangerous place. Leomaster said with a self-deprecating laugh, That's right. I worship the original creator. He is an omnipotent and omniscient existence, the source of everything great. He is the beginning and the end. He is the God of all gods. This, upon hearing how this person revered the original creator, Klein's first reaction was that it was the Twilight Hermit Order. However, there are also some smaller denominations in the northern and southern continents. There's quite a number of people who believe in the original creator. Klein deliberated as he asked, What's the name of that religious organization? How did you end up here? Leomaster hesitated for a moment before saying, To the far east of the Sonia Sea is where my lord sleeps. His sacred mountain is hidden somewhere there. I led a pilgrimage here in an attempt to witness his miracles to redeem myself. Perhaps it's a necessary test. We were caught by that devil, and one by one, we died. Later, I seized the opportunity to escape the cell and hid here, awaiting the devil's departure. Klein thought for a moment before saying, Do you know the name of that devil? What characteristics does he have? He? Leomaster shook his head, saying in a somewhat puzzled manner. I do not know his exact name, but many pilgrims seem to know him. They call him the Saint of Darkness. Saint of Darkness? A demigod? Is this Leomaster's dream, or is it the demigod's dream? From the outcome of my divination, it's likely the latter. Otherwise, it wouldn't be that dangerous. Klein was about to continue asking which organization Leomaster was from and determine the Beyonder powers of the Saint of Darkness when he suddenly noticed the full body mirror opposite the ascetic through the corner of his eye. In mysticism, mirrors were passages that connected hidden and unknown worlds. It easily brought about terrifying accidents. Therefore, Klein, who was in a dangerous dream, carefully walked over and planned on using the powers of a priest of light to destroy the item. No, don't. Leomaster seemed to sense Klein's intention as he cried out softly in horror. Without it, I will immediately die. Ah? Klein looked at the mirror again in puzzlement. Although the environment was abnormally dark, the mirror clearly reflected 2 figures. One of them was Leomaster with his numerous wrinkles and raven black hair. The other was the thin-faced, black-haired and brown-eyed Gehrman Sparrow who wore a cap. At this moment, the Gehrman Sparrow in the mirror slowly moved his head even though Klein didn't make any movements. He revealed a deep, sinister smile towards him. The mirror's surface suddenly rippled as a hand reached out. With just the blinking of his eyes, the Gehrman Sparrow, who looked identical to him, crawled out of the mirror. His face was tainted with an obvious sinisterness due to the darkness cloaking it. How terrifying. Unfortunately, I don't look like Gehrman Sparrow. Therefore, you failed to scare me. If Joe Mingrui came out of the mirror, I might have been woken up out of fright. Klein calmly looked at his counterpart and raised his left hand which swirled with a layer of sunlight. The sinister Gehrman Sparrow smiled as he raised his left hand as well, making a darkness that was made up of magnificence and sinisterness surface on his glove. This corresponded to the powers of a Baron of Corruption. My clone? Klein thought as he raised his right hand expressionlessly. From out of nowhere, he held a short milky white scepter in his palm, and at its tip were embedded blue gems. Sea God Scepter. Although his actions in a dream needed to abide by logic in order to achieve the desired effects, Klein suspected that the illusory world was unable to influence the mysterious space or the grey fog. Therefore, he attempted to simplify the ritualistic process and told himself that the Sea God Scepter was stored in a similar unique zone in the spirit world. He could retrieve it whenever he wanted. The outcome from his attempt delighted Klein. Indeed, the dream world was unable to differentiate between a unique zone in the spirit world and the space above the grey fog. With the premise of the Sea God Scepter belonging to him, this sealed artifact at the demigod level was retrieved. It really works, otherwise, I'd have to engage in an intense battle. Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief. He similarly believed that the mirror was unable to replicate matters related to the grey fog. The sinister Gehrman Sparrow looked opposite him in a dazed state. He instinctively raised his hand, but his right palm was empty. Then, he saw countless bolts of silver lightning shoot out, enveloping him inside, causing him to expend one paper figurine substitute after another without being able to escape from the area. With a sizzling sound, a huge ball of lightning illuminated the cramped room which provided no room for dodging. Following that, the Gehrman Sparrow from the mirror vanished. For some reason, Klein felt himself immediately turn serene, as though he had become a sage. He turned his head and looked at Leomaster again. What's the name of the religious organization you joined? Leomaster trembled as he answered, Aurora Order, Aurora Order? Klein was stunned as he couldn't help but prick up his brows. At this moment, there was a loud clanking outside. The locked gates that opened outwards had seemed to have been kicked open. Thump, thump, thump. The heavy footsteps that sounded like drumming walked towards the corner, seemingly discovering where Klein and Leomaster were hiding. Klein suspected that the lightning storm from before had been sensed by the Saint of Darkness. There's no way of hiding. Klein held the Sea God Scepter and kicked the black wooden door of the storage room open towards the Saint of Darkness. As the door tumbled, he clearly saw his target's appearance. The knight, who was wearing black full-body armor, had already raised up his visor at some point in time, revealing his deep wrinkled face and some of his bright raven-black hair, as well as the old scar on his cheek. He looked identical to Leomaster. Even the minute features were identical. The only difference was the deep redness that emitted from his eyes. Exclamation mark. Klein was alarmed. He instinctively turned his body to the side without exposing his back to Leomaster, who was trembling in horror in the storage room. He couldn't be certain that the prisoner wearing a short linen robe wasn't problematic. At this moment, the deep redness in the black-armored knight who had the same face as Leomaster brightened drastically. He raised up the gloomy broadsword in his hands. Bam! With a step forward, he cleaved forward at a speed that Klein couldn't capture with his naked eyes. At the same time, Klein, who was standing to the side of him, subconsciously raised the Sea God Scepter and made the blue gems at its tip light up simultaneously. Whoosh! A corporeal hurricane appeared out of thin air as it swirled around Klein, protecting him within the eye of the hurricane. Whoosh! The black streams of light carved its way over as layer after layer of the strong winds dissipated, scattering in every direction, causing the entire hall to tremble. Boom! Under the black broadsword, the hurricane produced an explosive boom and was reduced to a surging wave that flooded the entire region. It lifted up all the junk into the air. The intense collision clearly shook the dream as Klein felt his mind go adrift. He couldn't help but roll twice. Plop! He fell from his bed to the floor, the fall causing him to open his eyes. That Saint of Darkness is really powerful. Or should I say that I've never used the sea god's scepter in the real world, so I'm unable to replicate its full might in the dream. Wait. It's still night. Klein suddenly noticed a problem. At that moment, the midday sunlight wasn't beaming in from the windows. His awakening was due to the intense struggle in the dream, not due to a natural occurrence. That also meant that he needed to sleep immediately. Otherwise, he might very well disappear in the dark night, never to be found again. With that thought flashing in his mind, Klein pushed his right hand to the ground, flipping his body up as he flew towards his bed and laid himself down. Then, he imagined the stacked spherical lights and quickly entered his dream. During this process, Klein swept his gaze to the window and vaguely saw the dark night outside. It was quiet and serene without any sense of sinisterness. Meanwhile, he vaguely felt that there was a fog encompassing the surface of the sea relatively far away. Amidst the fog, there was a cathedral composed of rather ancient architecture. It was completely black in color. There wasn't a bell tower, and at the top of it were pitch-black ravens spiraling around it as though they were consecrating or lamenting over something. This cathedral has many buildings around it. There are ordinary two-story residences and simple wooden huts. There are bread shops with hanging signboards and grayish-white mills using water wheels for power. Pedestrians pass through the main streets and alleys with their figures flitting about, impossible to know of their actual situations. A mirage? The source of the danger at night? All the people who disappeared had lost their minds and went somewhere? Klein woke up from his dreams because he subconsciously considered the questions that he had accumulated. Following that, he forcefully made himself concentrate. He retrieved the sea god's scepter from the spirit world's unique zone. He remembered that he was in an intense battle with the Saint of Darkness just before he left the dream. The slightly dim golden light shone into Klein's eyes as everything immediately turned bright. What he could see was no longer the tall knight dressed in black full-bodied armor, nor was it Leomaster, who was dressed in a short linen robe. Instead, he was facing a floor-to-ceiling window that faced the setting sun. The window was very clean and revealed an indescribable sense of purity under the sun's illumination. By the side of the window were tables with their original wooden colors and black high-backed chairs. Further away were rows of bookshelves with all kinds of books placed on them. A library? A book repository? Every time I enter this dream world, I'll be placed randomly in a certain area? Klein carefully observed his surroundings and confirmed that it was temporarily safe without the so-called Saint of Darkness or strange evil creatures. He held the sea god's scepter and first came to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked at the environment outside. The first thing that he saw was the opulent buildings that covered the opposite mountain peak. The huge palaces, magnificent steeples, and the towering city walls that all appeared frozen in the sunset. It was a visual spectacle. Even though it wasn't his first time seeing it, Klein still held his breath, quietly admiring this miraculous scenery for a few seconds. He then moved his gaze away towards the cliff. He saw the high walls of the black cloister and the withered trees beside the boulders. But as they were blocked, it was impossible to confirm whether Catalya remained in her original spot. Indeed, within a certain radius, it's not possible to leave this region. I'm deep inside the black cloister? Klein retracted his gaze in thought as he walked to the bookshelves. He temporarily didn't have the time to consider what happened between the Saint of Darkness and Leomaster in his previous dream. This was because he needed to determine his current situation. When he arrived by the bookshelves, Klein discovered that the books placed on them had their own names. They weren't blurry and indistinct like ordinary dreams. The Spirituality of Life, Book of Charms, The Flower Within the Heart, The True Cosmos and Inner Universe. These are all books on mysticism. Klein carefully reached out and took out the Book of Charms. He quickly flipped through it and realized that he knew most of the content, but there was a small portion which he had never come into contact with. It can be confirmed that this isn't from my dream. Ma'am Hermits? The knowledge that pursues her and is injected into her has been conjured in this black cloister? Klein had no desire to explore beyond where he was. He held the Book of Charms and returned to the side of the floor-to-ceiling window. He found a spot to sit down and began reading in a serious manner with the sunset's glow. You can still study even in dreams. As he lampooned, he took out a pen and paper as he wrote and drew. While he was engrossed in this, the light suddenly bloomed as blinding whiteness blanketed his vision. Klein naturally opened his eyes and felt warmth from the sunlight that shone inwards. I just read a few pages and planned to speed read it before using dream divination to recall them. Klein sat up, frustrated. He felt like he had lost a good opportunity to study. This was because he couldn't determine if he would be randomly placed in the Black Cloister's library again. He straightened his hair, wore his cap, and went to the deck. As he observed his surroundings, he recalled the dream. That prison is likely inside the Black Cloister as well. Yes, it might be underground. In other words, the Saint of Darkness and Leomaster are in a ruin nearby. It's no wonder that Will Ossipton told me not to attempt exploring the dream. These places are really filled with danger. Why would the Saint of Darkness and Leomaster look identical? That dream was a little strange. Also, that full body mirror was very magical and sinister. It actually managed to clone a Gehrman sparrow. Upon recalling this, Klein began to find examples from his past experiences to confirm his through processes by comparison. This was called relying on experience. Soon, he thought of something. He had once borrowed the Mendel Terror Candle in Backland and helped Father Utrevsky eliminate the past him. A character that was dissociated from his original self. Could it be that Leomaster is the Saint of Darkness from the Aurora Order? Due to certain reasons, he had split his personality, separating his good and evil sides? That sealed and dark prison is the reflection of his inner dream? Yes, that full-bodied mirror. Leomaster had said that if it were destroyed, he would vanish as well. When I looked into the mirror, the Gehrman sparrow inside it did form a corporeal body. It was evil. It's no wonder I felt like a sage after I eliminated the Gehrman sparrow in the mirror. It's because I got rid of my evil and sinister thoughts in my mind. Yes, that full-body mirror must be in the form of a mirror in the real world. These waters clearly have the Beyonder remains of a visionary. It conjures many unreal and real monsters that can kill. And this belongs to the spectator pathway. Therefore, being able to split good from evil and causing dissociated personalities does make logical sense. Saint of Darkness Leomaster is a high-ranking member of the Aurora Order. He must originally be very evil, but that ruin or item stirred up his inverse side, which is the good hidden deep in his heart. It caused a split personality. Hence, he is trapped somewhere nearby. Klein felt that he had roughly understood the truth to the matter and felt a little regret. Unfortunately, I'm unable to enter the same spot a second time. Otherwise, with the Sea God Scepter and Leomaster's good side, there's a high chance of defeating his evil side, the Saint of Darkness. And the damage dealt in the dream world would continue on in the real world. In that case, a good saint who understands the Aurora Order would be born. It will make it easier to strike down on this cultist organization. Klein silently sighed and turned halfway around and watched Anderson Hood walk out of the cabin. Where did you go in the dream? I didn't actually find you, the strongest hunter asked as though they were best buds. Klein secretly frowned as he asked, why should I be seen by you? Anderson was taken aback. Shouldn't you return to the spot where you left the dream upon returning there again? There are other elements involved in my random appearance in other spots within a particular radius? Something to do with my uniqueness? Klein realized that the problem was more complex than he had imagined. He said with some deliberation, I went elsewhere after entering the dream. Strange, Anderson frowned as though he was very puzzled. Without waiting for Klein to speak, he thought before speaking again, there's another strange incident. What? Klein asked cooperatively. Anderson surveyed his surroundings. Back when I was pretending to make a canoe in the hall last time, I heard the sounds of a door opening and of footsteps that came out from deep inside. But when I looked up, I found nothing. I originally thought that it was someone from the ship, but later it didn't seem like the case. Someone opened a door deep in the Hall of Murals and came out? A rampager or Beyonder creature who was nearby. Furthermore, it possesses the ability to act in dreams? After hearing Anderson Hood's description, Klein began making logical speculations. As his thoughts whirled, he suddenly had a new idea. Could it be the owner of the mysterious eyes that observed me in the deck? It's possible. If that mysterious person has been lurking on the ship the entire time and followed us into these waters, then he'd have to sleep when night falls, so he will appear in the dream world. Ma'am Hermit is completely unaware of his existence, or has she tacitly agreed to his actions? Or he's the trump card that she wields, which is why she isn't afraid of the dangers in these waters when taking on my mission? No, that cannot be determined. At the very least, I can't determine that the person who opened the door deep inside the Hall of Murals is the mysterious person on the ship. Klein looked at Anderson with a deep, gloomy look before asking, why does it seem unlikely? Back when Anderson Hood mentioned it, he originally suspected that the person who opened the door was a member of the future, but he later felt that it was unlikely. Anderson chuckled. I visited every person on the ship in the dream, and I discovered that no one possesses the ability to act freely in that world except you. Unfortunately, I was pushing open a door outside back then, Klein said calmly. Anderson shrugged and said, I know, that's why I'm not suspecting you. These waters have dangers lurking everywhere. All sorts of unimaginable monsters are active here. Perhaps the person opening the door from before was the stone giant from earlier or a rotting dragon who dreamed of countless treasures. Upon saying this, he leaned against the side of the ship and looked at the sea which was bathing in golden sunlight as he smiled wistfully. I discovered that ever since I escaped the ship sinking crisis brought about by the storm, my bad luck has been decreasing bit by bit. Haha, it's obvious that it's not fixed and wouldn't last forever. Look, I successfully swam onto the island, and although I kept meeting with all kinds of bad luck, I managed to last until you arrived. Yes, I do attract monsters and did make that stone giant appear, but didn't we easily resolve it? Also, nothing happened despite me being on board for several hours. Doesn't that explain? Before Anderson could finish his statement, Klein coldly cut him off. Shut up. Doesn't this guy know to keep his words to a minimum when faced with a livid expression? I really want to beat him up. If it wasn't for the divination above the grey fog that said that you haven't mutated or have a big shot possessing you, then I would have already sunk you to the bottom of the sea. Yes. Sequence 8 of the Hunter pathway as provoker. He must have easily digested the potion back then. From the bottom of his heart, Klein felt that the level of Anderson's provocation was far higher than Dannett's. Without feeling frustrated, Anderson raised his arms and said with a rueful smile, Fine, fine. I'll shut up. Seeing how he wasn't providing him with any more clues about the individual who opened the door in the dream world, Klein remained silent for a few seconds, suddenly turned around, and walked into the cabin. He had discovered a huge oversight on something. Since Anderson, who's plagued with bad luck, was on the ship, that meant that the chances of them experiencing an incident would only increase exponentially. Therefore, he needed to make some preparations. After returning to his room, Klein walked to the bathroom as he picked up Azek's copper whistle and Will Ossepton's paper crane. After setting up the ritual to summon himself, he brought Tinder, the sunbrooch, and the nightmare Beyander characteristic from above the grey fog into the real world. He didn't immediately switch out his equipped inventory, but he did place them inside his suitcase and beside the biological poison bottle. This way, even if danger suddenly struck, he would have a chance to adjust his inventory, and then he could make a selection based on the danger he faced. After doing all of this, Klein felt significantly relaxed. He put away the other items and left the room for the deck, afraid that he would miss any signs of mermaids. Just as he walked out of the cabin, he saw Frank Lee crouched in a corner, looking shocked and dazed. What happened? Klein felt his heart skip a beat. He was afraid that something had gone wrong with the crazy crossbreeder's experiments, causing everyone on the future to be embroiled in a terrifying biological disaster. Frank shook his head in a daze. Didn't I mention about those little things before? They actually need to sleep for some time before they can grow and reproduce. In the end. What happened in the end? Klein's expression turned solemn. This made the strongest hunter Anderson, who was bragging about how many pirates he had hunted to the audience around him without realizing the change in their eyes, sensed something as he curiously stopped his description and came over. The crouching Frank looked up and said, They just finished a large-scale reproduction stage and have even mutated. This is a miracle. And? Where have they gone? Are they still in your laboratory? Klein instinctively felt that this wasn't something good. Frank used 2 seconds to digest the problem as he rolled up his sleeves to show his hairy arm. He pounded the deck in front of him and revealed a smile. They have drilled inside and have seemingly reconstructed the future. Amidst the dull pounding, something that seemed like milk spewed out like a fountain from the deck, spraying Frank Lee in the face. He licked the liquid by his lips and said in pleasant surprise, The future. The future has produced milk. At the same time, the pirates by the side of the ship pointed down at the cannons in horror. The cannons are spewing milk. This isn't scientific. Klein nearly couldn't control the twitching of his facial muscles. Ever since he boarded the future, and ever since the ship came to the ravine and began the descent, he felt that many of the things that had happened were extremely unscientific. It even exceeded the confines of his mysticism knowledge. Anderson watched Agape, nearly forgetting to inquire. He stomped his feet habitually and successfully saw another milk fountain spew out. One thought after another flashed past Klein's mind as he acutely figured out a problem. He immediately looked at Frank Lee and asked in a deep voice, After your little things have infected the future, will it continue infecting people? While asking, Klein's right palm reached into his pocket. According to the situation, he selected the floating charm and prepared to fly into the air in order to escape the infection. Frank Lee thought seriously for a moment. In theory, yes. Before he finished his sentence, a figure appeared and kicked him in the ass, sending him tumbling a few times, slamming into pools of milk. That person was none other than linen-shirted Nina, who was draped in a blue jacket. She glared angrily at Frank Lee on the deck as she cursed while hyperventilating. Aren't you going to finish off those darn little things of yours? Did you do this while thinking that my breasts aren't big enough? All right, Frank Lee patted his ass and said unwillingly. At this moment, Klein had already taken out his charm and softly chanted, "Storm." He believed that he had underestimated Frank Lee's ability to cause trouble and suspected that the disaster brought about by him would only worsen. Therefore, he decided to first fly into the air. Blue flames enveloped the charm made of tin as squalls immediately stirred. They swirled around Klein's feet and body, lifting him off the deck into a height of 4 to 5 meters. Anderson was first taken aback before he reached out his palm in an attempt to grab Klein, but he was a moment too late. All he could do was watch Gehrman Sparrow rise up as he remained standing on the spot. This ordinarily handsome hunter shook his head with a warped expression, somewhat amused while also wanting to dismember the first mate of the future. At this moment, Frank had already taken a bottle of dark green powder. He grabbed a handful of it, and as he chanted in Jotun, he scattered it around his surroundings. The moment the powder made contact with the deck, it immediately produced green vines that grew wildly. Soon, it drew out the milk and the little things, entangling the entire deck and cabin within. In just about 10 seconds, the future had been reduced into a forest of vines. Phew, it's over. Frank smiled at Nina before his expression changed again. They've mutated. At this moment, a pirate walked over in a stagger, shouting with a tinge of horror, A watermelon is growing from my head. Klein looked towards the voice and saw a green vine drilling out of the pirate's head. One of them seemed to produce a soon-to-ripen watermelon. This is the so-called mutation? This is way too crazy, goddamn madness. Anderson blurted out a sigh. His eyes then darted around as he said in a deep voice, there's something wrong with the surrounding waters. In midair, Klein had also determined the same thing. If there wasn't any external disruptions, then Frank Lee's experimental products and Beyonder powers wouldn't have caused a simultaneous mutation. Rip. One vine after another tore apart as the window to the captain's cabin opened. Catalya appeared there and shouted in an amplified voice with witchcraft, Frank, stop all experiments. There are remnant auras of Mother Earth here. Mother Earth? Klein looked in surprise at Mam Hermit, and he felt that his theories about these waters being the battlefield of the gods had been completely overturned. Oh my, merciful mother. Frank crossed his arms and made a pose like he was hugging a baby. Following that, he sprawled on the floor as he devoutly kissed the vines. Catalya silently watched this scene as resplendent stars instantly swirled around her. Following that, she made the entire future light up. With a flick of her finger, she made a colorless flame land on the vine outside the window of the captain's cabin. The vines were immediately ignited as they silently turned to ashes. The colorless flames silently spread and wreaked havoc, without harming a single sailor. As for the future, the light it produced helped it withstand the fire. Before long, the forest of vines vanished completely, leaving behind the pirate who had a watermelon growing on his head. Of course, the vine that was connected to it had been burned to nothingness. Phew, this is no different from a devil's descent. The pirate took 2 steps forward and carried the watermelon which had grown out from his head. Don't open it. Just as Catalya's warning reverberated, the pirate had opened the watermelon with brute force, partially to vent his anger and partially to satisfy his curiosity. The watermelon split into 2, and inside it was a milky white brain, filled with gullies. Flowing around it was a blood-like liquid. With a thud, the pirate died immediately, without any chance of saving him. The Beyonder characteristics on him rapidly condensed at an extraordinary speed. How sinister and crazy. Klein sighed silently and prepared to land back onto the deck. At that moment, he saw a gigantic palm suddenly reach out from the surface of the sea, smacking the side of the future. The 5 fingers of the palm were long, each almost half a meter long. The entire thing was a grayish-black color like an arid desert. Klein silently drew out a gasp as he couldn't help but look at Anderson Hood. This fellow had just mentioned that nothing had happened since he came on board. The grayish-black hand grabbed the side of the ship and quickly hoisted it up, revealing the submerged parts, inch by inch. Through the blue water waves, Klein saw a huge grayish-black shadow. Following that, squirming flesh occupied his entire vision. The monster seemed to be an amalgamation of countless blackening or graying corpses. Attached to the two gigantic palms were withered-looking arms that resembled dry timber. The arms stemmed from a corpse that was suspected to be from a giant. This giant's single eye was shut tightly as a few heads were stuck to its neck. And further down these heads were incomplete scaly fish, lizard bodies, or warped human corpses. Layer after layer, they formed flesh that appeared like a floating island. From the different corpses and the connections of the crevices, a yellowish-green gas was emanated and spread to its surroundings as though it was enveloping the entire area. Cough, 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 cough. Just the smell of it had made many sailors on deck cough violently. It was so bad that they couldn't even straighten their backs. Upon seeing this scene, Frank Lee didn't hesitate to take out the materials inside a hidden pouch on his belt. He showcased his corresponding Beyonder powers, but to his surprise, Catalya's voice rang in his ears. "Frank, stop. Help Nina command the sailors to get them to adjust the sails." "Why?" Frank Lee subconsciously asked in return. "In this area, the supernatural matters within the authority of Mother Earth will mutate, including your powers." As Catalya spoke, she extended both her palms forward and pressed down on a particular spot on her desk. The symbols and the magical labels on the future immediately became more pronounced as they lit up one after another, converting the entire ship into a resplendent sea of stars. They seemed to correspond to each and every point of starlight that swirled around Catalya's body. The spreading yellowish-green gas was kept out as Klein began floating towards the window of his room from the closest wall. The coughing pirates felt alleviated, and under the lead of Bosun Nina and first mate Frank, as well as the instructions of Atolov, they quickly adjusted the sails and attempted to make the future escape from the nearby waters in order to escape the influence of the mutation effects. However, the grayish-black colossal monster had held back the front of the ship, and the body beneath the water had connected to unknown parts of the ship in order to hold the future, preventing it from advancing forward. At the same time, formless tall mountains seemed to appear around them, blocking out the sea winds that blew from afar, preventing the future from using its strength no matter how it adjusted its sails. Faced with such a situation, there's a need to use a backup steam engine system. Unfortunately, the future lacks it. Yes, it can still fly with the help of the starlight, but that seems to be extremely draining on Ma'am Hermit. Besides, it will be difficult to grasp the direction and distance it will bring us. To make such a flight in such waters, there's a high chance of entering a more dangerous zone without being blessed with good luck. Hey, there's still the extremely unlucky Anderson on board. Klein floated by the window in his room as he took in the situation. He wasn't nervous, as neither Admiral of Stars Catalya nor the strongest hunter Anderson had showcased their true strength. Of course, that includes me as well, Klein added inwardly. He planned on first returning to his room and wearing tinder. Without any food around, using such a mystical item was more suitable than creeping hunger. The latter was to be reserved for him when facing more dangerous and complicated situations before throwing it above the gray fog for it to cool down. As for the negative effect of losing items on him, Klein already had a plan. He decided to put in his wallet, Azek's copper whistle, the adventurer's harmonica, and other items into his suitcase when changing his inventory, leaving Creeping Hunger, Murloc Cufflink, and the charms from the Sea God domain. He would keep a close watch on the latter two to prevent them from being lost. And from a probability standpoint, the most likely item to be lost by Tinder would be the charms since they were the greatest in number. Klein wasn't worried about this. He had created charms with different effects. They were highly disposable. Besides, the corresponding metal in the storm domain is tin. It's very cheap and worth nothing. The Beyonder effects are bestowed by the Sea God Scepter, so I don't have to spend any additional money. As Klein mumbled, he reached out to push open the window to his room. At this moment, the colossal grayish-black monster, which was a combination of flesh, climbed higher again. With its approach, the busy sailors had their hair grow wildly, to the point of exceeding their waists. This wasn't the most terrifying outcome. It was more harrowing that the blob of flaxen-colored hair seemed to have a life of its own. They would interweave and bind themselves to their owners. As the hair began to produce similar changes, the lustrous sea of stars on the surface of the future could no longer hold back this influence. To a number of pirates who had shaved themselves bald, their uniqueness didn't bring them luck either. Their nose hair would rapidly grow at a discernible pace, blocking their nasal passageways. By the window of the captain's cabin, Catalya had raised her arms at some point in time. In her hand was a scroll made of smooth fishskin. Num. As the incantation in ancient Hermes resounded while the scroll burned in silence, a light green luster shot out from within, striking the monster's gigantic palm that appeared by the side of the ship. The squirming flesh formed from countless corpses didn't pause at all. It slammed down on the lustrous sea of stars, sending sparks flying while the ship trembled. The dark purple color in the depths of Catalya's eyes deepened. She didn't take out a new scroll, and she instead directly pushed her right palm forward. Imprison. When the mysterious incantation came out of the pirate admiral's mouth, the resplendent starlight that swirled around her flew out, descending upon the terrifying monster. The starlight instantly converged, creating a gigantic, transparent amber. It enclosed all of the squirming flesh and bound it to where it was. At this moment, a pitch-black and lusterless short sword appeared in the strongest Hunter Anderson's right hand. On the surface of it was layers of diabolical patterns, but they were only an illusion. Seizing the opportunity of having the terrifying monster trapped in the starlight cage, Anderson's body produced a layer of blinding white flames. The flames flew forward, leapt out of the ship, and landed on the grayish-black flesh which was formed from countless corpses. Following that, the blinding white light rapidly flowed across the monster's surface as if it was engaged in painting an extreme piece of artwork. With a boom, the flames surged into the sky as Anderson jumped back onto the deck with his pitch-black sword. The colossal monster remained frozen in place, as though it had lost all its vitality. Crack! 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 Deep wounds appeared on its surface, shattering into countless pieces of flesh in just a second. A Reaper's offensive strength is truly exaggerated. Klein, who had redone his inventory, returned to the side of the window to see this scene. Suddenly, he frowned indiscernibly. At this moment, something unexpected happened. The fractured pieces of flesh spread out their limbs, shooting towards the deck in a barrage of attacks. This colossal attacher seemed impossible to kill no matter how many pieces it was divided into. The number of pieces determined the number of monsters. Silently, a piece of grayish-black flesh facing the captain's cabin jumped up from the deck, heading straight for Admiral of Stars in a bid to wrap around her head. A figure surfaced from the darkness and shielded Catalya. It was none other than bloodless Heath Doyle. He opened his mouth as they cracked open, all the way from his nose to his chest. Soon, he formed a squirming vortex of flesh and blood. The vortex sucked at the grayish-black flesh and rapidly swirled inwardly, pulling it inside. Heath Doyle landed on the deck like a shadow. After wavering a little, he finally recovered. As for the grayish-black flesh that had splintered off from the monster, it had completely disappeared. The most terrifying part of the monster is its ridiculous vitality. If only this trait can be stolen. Having used another floating charm, Klein floated out the window. He reached out his black-gloved right hand and spread his fingers. The scene before him changed as a result. Blobs of different, gorgeous colors replaced the corresponding people and items. These colors kept changing as they rapidly twinkled, making it difficult for anyone to grasp the rules it followed. With the help of this vision, Klein discovered that the grayish-black flesh shared some of this luster. Although it was splintered, it was actually one. Calmly, he clenched his right fist, grabbed a blob of the light, and turned his wrist to the right. Suddenly, Klein saw the yellowish-green luster being drawn away, fusing into his right palm. This was the corresponding trait of the fog of poison. He had stolen the grayish-black monster's fog of poison. This was Tinder's effect. At the same time, Klein discovered that his damage transfer Beyonder power was lost. He no longer had it. I can only steal from the same target once every 12 hours. With some level of realization, Klein looked at the surrounded future. The yellowish-green fog which was corroding the resplendent sea of stars rapidly thinned and no longer looked obvious. The grayish-black flesh that scattered everywhere also showed signs of desiccating and darkening. With that, the pirates found a chance to catch their breath. As for Catalya, she wore a golden brooch on the front of her classic robe. The brooch seemed to be made of gold, and it was shaped like a bird with a long feather tail. The surrounding atmosphere suddenly turned staid and serene. All the chaos and anxiety vanished in a baffling manner. Even Klein sensed the indescribable influence and felt like he had become an emotionless zombie. Seeing how the critical moment was at hand, a ship came cruising over. It was also a sailboat and was equally large. Its color was mainly dark with a ghostly green to it. Its ghastly pale mainsail drew a blooming pitch-black tulip. It was the flagship of Admiral Hell Ludwell, the Black Tulip. It was a ship that frequently plied these waters. The Black Tulip. Admiral Hell Ludwell. This is jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. Aren't we a little too unlucky? Floating in midair, Klein was the first to discover the approaching ship. He couldn't help but turn his head to look down at Anderson, who was wielding his pitch-black sword and seriously observing the monster. Anderson quickly returned the gaze in puzzlement. As he remained wary against the grayish-black flesh which could shoot out at any moment, he asked, "The look you are giving me is very strange. Did something happen again?" Just as he said that, he reflexively shut his mouth and sensed something. With a leap, he dodged the monster's splintered body which was making his fingernails rapidly grow. He quickly arrived at the other side of the ship. As he straightened his back, Anderson suddenly hissed. Admiral Hell. He wasn't a good person. As a pirate admiral who was infamous for killing indiscriminately, he didn't have any psychological burdens when it came to earning profit by fishing in troubled waters. Once he weighed the situation and realized that he could use the powerful monster to finish off Admiral of Stars and everyone on the future while also receiving tremendous spoils of war, he would definitely take action. My bad luck hasn't decreased at all. It has only switched to a lump sum withdrawal? Anderson's expression warped. It was a mystery on whether he was crying or laughing. At the same time, the corresponding information surfaced in Klein's mind. Just the bounty placed on Admiral Hell Ludwell's head by Lowen alone had reached £55,000. He was an extremely powerful member of the 7 pirate admirals, the one with the highest bounty among the 7 pirate admirals. His flagship, the Black Tulip, didn't have many pirates living on it. Most of the jobs were left to undead creatures or the spirit world creatures he controlled. He killed indiscriminately, but he didn't have a sick fetish for killing. All he did was seriously complete his job of sending living creatures to hell. He had all kinds of connections with the numinous episcopate. The rumors state that he possesses a ring left behind by the ancient death. While Klein and Anderson were looking at the Black Tulip, the golden brooch on Catalya's robe began to emit a pure bright light instead of blinding sunlight. In front of the captain's cabin was a blurry figure that was rapidly increasing in length. It was filled with the silence and serenity of a specter's aura, but it also emitted a warmth resembling sunlight. This was an extraordinarily incongruent existence. It was as though a wraith had been created out of sun-holy water. It was both holy and evil. The sun wraith widened its arms as it flew out at ludicrous speeds and hugged the grayish-black flesh. The sizzling sound of fat and oils burning sounded out. The sun wraith and the grayish-black flesh cancelled each other out as they were simultaneously obliterated, leaving no traces behind. The dark purple hue in the Admiral of Stars' eyes flowed as the brooch brightened. It quickly produced another sun wraith outside the window of the captain's cabin as it pounced towards the grayish-black flesh that had invaded the future. And at this moment, bloodless Heath Doyle protected Frank, Nina, and the other sailors. He used the devouring and digesting method in order to resist the monster's flesh which possessed immense vitality. The Black Tulip's speed was faster than Klein had anticipated. In seconds, it had entered a range which was cause for alarm for the future. The black sailboat with a gloomy green slowed down and stopped to the side. It didn't seem to be aware of what had happened. Suddenly, Klein saw a nearly transparent eye surface around the future's airspace. It had ghastly pale eye whites as it looked down from above without blinking. This is a spirit medium's version of a telescope? After a momentary pause, Klein drew his revolver with his right hand and aimed at the eye that belonged to a spirit world creature. At that moment, he was somewhat hesitant. As the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, to directly fire was the choice that matched his persona the best. But at this moment, Admiral Hell Ludwell had yet to show any signs of animosity. He might have qualms about the faction backing Catalya and hold back. If Klein were to rashly kill the telescope, it would undoubtedly push the situation into the direction of a more chaotic and dangerous development. During that brief dilemma, the nearly transparent illusory eye vanished. A distance away, the Black Tulip continued approaching as it became clearer and clearer. High above the Black Tulip, white skeletons, who didn't wear clothes or leather armor, busily controlled the sails while pale zombies patrolled the area with cutlasses in hand. The latter were observing their surroundings with green burning eyes. Shadows, wraiths, and all sorts of strange spirit world creatures were flying in circles, boring through the ship at times as the shipboard protruded transparent faces that weren't too obvious. Amidst Klein's spirit vision, the Black Tulip only had one living person. It was the man dressed like a captain, who was silently standing on the deck. He wore an exaggerated triangular hat with a white skull and feathers on it. He wore a lace-trimmed white shirt and a heavy and magnificent brown coat. The ox-hide belt which held his white tights had a thin rapier hanging off it. The man wore a silver mask. His facial features and contours were hidden within. The holes that depicted his eyes, nose, and mouth had cold lines that left one shuddering. This matched the rumored image of Admiral Hal Ludwell. Where are his first mate, second mate, third mate, and bosun? Klein was first surprised at the lack of living personnel on the Black Tulip before quickly coming to a realization. Just like how the third mate, the gunner commander, and many of the sailors of the future were sent to the other ships of the pirate crew, only the minimum number of personnel were used to enter these waters. Admiral Hal Ludwell didn't let his weak subordinates follow him. After all, he could control the undead and spirit world creatures to steer the ship. At this moment, the Black Tulip clearly turned around and aimed its starboard side over. As Admiral Hal Ludwell touched his silver mask, a salvo of shots rang out. Cannonballs flew over, some falling into the sea before they came close, producing splashes. Others overshot and fell somewhere even further away. This was a calibration shot. Soon, the Black Tulip produced a second volley of bombarding cannon fire. Klein was just about to activate Creeping Hunger and use the Baron of Corruption's distortion power to change the target of the cannonballs, sending them further away when he saw Anderson Hood raise his right hand and push it forward. Orange-yellow fire ravens instantly condensed as they accurately flew out to intercept each and every cannonball. Boom! 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 Blinding flames were emitted in midair as debris scattered. It was as though dozens of fireworks were set on display. I have to say that a pyromaniac's powers are very useful at sea. It's a mystic version of a ballistic missile defense system. However, this is because Anderson is the strongest hunter and has already reached Sequence 5. If it were Danitz, there's no way he could block them all. It would be pretty impressive if he could trigger half of them. Sigh, when I use flame controlling, I can only deal with one cannonball at a time. As Klein sighed, the Black Tulip ceased its bombardment and changed its speed again, closing the gap between it and the future. As it approached, the surface of the sea between the two gigantic sailboats which was dyed with golden sunlight rapidly turned black. It didn't look like ink, but the darkest night without any moon or stars. Translucent and illusory ferocious creatures crawled out of this dark sea. Pale corpses reached out their palms which had rotten flesh dangling from them as dark red or cold flames emerged, forming pairs of eyes. Suddenly, the area seemed to turn into the entrance to hell. All kinds of undead creatures floated on the surface of the sea in dense numbers as they charged forward like an unending tidal wave. Anderson looked back at the sunwraiths which were obliterating the grayish-black flesh, and he knew that Admiral of Stars was at a critical moment in dealing with the terrifying monster. All he could do was draw a gasp and look up at Gehrman Sparrow with a bitter smile. Just as he was about to press his hands onto the shipboard to create scarlet flames that spread outwards to prevent the invasion of the undead army, he was surprised to see Gehrman Sparrow turn around and fly back into his cabin. He fled? No way. Anderson's expression clearly froze. He grimaced as he hurriedly leaned forward with his extended palms to press onto the shipboard. Silently, a swath of scarlet flames soared into the sky and swept the area ahead of him. At this moment, a charm suddenly fell in front of him as he heard a word spoken in ancient Hermes. Storm. Huh? Anderson instinctively looked up and saw Gehrman Sparrow in his round neck shirt and brown jacket being swept up by a squall as he rapidly flew towards the Black Tulip. Is he committing suicide? I can't understand such madness. Anderson turned agape as he felt puzzled. Whoosh! With the charm's effects and the blessings of the wind, Klein flew to the airspace above the bow of the Black Tulip. Admiral Hal Ludwell immediately looked up at him. The eyes behind the silver mask burned silently with two pale white flames. The shadows, wraiths, and the spirit world creatures of the Death Domain who were spiraling above the Black Tulip immediately swarmed towards the enemy. They either opened their mouths, letting out silent screeches, or they extended their long tongues with shrunken faces as though they were extremely excited. Klein looked at them with a deadpan expression as he reached into his pocket with his left hand, releasing the wall of spirituality on a squarish box. Then, he took out Azek's copper whistle, which was tied to a few matchsticks, and threw them at the deck of the Black Tulip's stern. Suddenly, the transparent, cold, and indistinct shadows and wraiths paused. It was as though they were frozen worms. Following that, they didn't hesitate to turn their bodies to rapidly fly to the stern of the Black Tulip. The strange-looking spirit world creatures followed closely behind. In less than a second, the skeletons and zombies who were adjusting the cannons betrayed Admiral Hell. The bow was left completely empty except for Ludwell. Paw! Klein landed on the deck while pressing down on his cap, landing right before Ludwell. His body was bent slightly as he released the right hand on his cap, his gaze locked on the silver-masked Admiral Hell. On the future, Anderson Hood pressed his hands on the shipboard and saw the undead army in the pitch-black sea recede like the tide. They rushed over one another and surged for the stern of the Black Tulip. He saw Gehrman Sparrow press his cap with his right hand while he descended from the sky before landing opposite Admiral Hell Ludwell. Such a scene was illuminated by dark red or gloomy green light. With the accentuation from the wraiths, shadows, and all sorts of strange spirit world creatures, there was an indescribable sense of beauty. Cool. As expected of the craziest adventurer. Anderson praised from the bottom of his heart before recalling something. Gehrman Sparrow had apparently thrown a charm in front of him before flying over. Furthermore, he had specially demonstrated the incantation to activate the charm. His intent is. Anderson Hood moved his gaze down and discovered a charm made of tin at his feet. On the Black Tulip, Klein, whose body was slightly bent while his eyes were locked onto his enemy, wasn't actually as cold and calm as his expression depicted. Anderson better fly over with the charm. There's a high chance that I can't deal with him alone. It might even be very dangerous. While his eyes reflected the silver mask and the two pale white flames, Klein silently prayed. As the mysterious eyes that observed the deck and himself existed, as well as the door opener in the dream world which Anderson Hood had mentioned, he cautiously gave up the idea of immediately praying to himself in order to use the sea god's scepter above the grey fog to respond. He also warned himself not to expose such matters unless he was in dire straits. He believed that creeping hunger and tinder, together with the various Beyonder powers of magician and the charms of the sea god domain, gave him the ability to fight Admiral Hell Ludwell. As for Azek's copper whistle, it could attract undead creatures or spirit world creatures that were inclined to death's domain. It could neutralize the most powerful means of a powerful spirit medium. For a sequence 5 Beyonder of the death pathway, as long as it didn't exceed a certain number, one would often choose to overwhelm their enemy with numbers when facing a certain number of mid-sequence Beyonders. However, Klein didn't believe that he alone could defeat Ludwell in such a situation or even kill him. Firstly, the battlefield would be held on the Black Tulip. Considering how Admiral of Stars could use the future, anyone with a brain knew that such a situation wasn't optimistic. Secondly, Ludwell was the most senior pirate admiral at the moment. He had the two powerful factions, the King of the Five Seas and the Numinous Episcopate, backing him. The mystical items and sealed artifacts he had might not be any weaker than Klein's or might even exceed his. In addition, many rumors indicated that he possessed a ring that was left behind by the Ancient Death. Along with the fact that his sequence was lower than Admiral Hell, Klein was not only lacking in the adrenaline of a pending successful hunt or of performing great acting in the role of a crazy adventurer, but he was also tense and anxious. He didn't dare to be careless. All he wished was that the strongest hunter who was plagued with bad luck would quickly fly over. Only when two people of equivalent strength allied together could they have a small chance of defeating or resisting Ludwell, who had lost his undead army. It also gave Catalya and her pirates time and space to finish off the pieced-together monster. Just as this thought flashed across his mind, Klein didn't hesitate to launch an attack. He made the fog of poison which he stole with tinder spread. No one could see the uneasiness and worry in his heart. Wearing an exaggerated triangular hat and silver mask, Ludwell raised his clenched left fist, spread his fingers, and aimed his palm at Klein. Instantly, the deck of the bow was enveloped by a harrowing yellowish-green fog. And in front of Ludwell, an illusory glow exploded. Following that, a point spiraled and collapsed inwardly, outlining a blurry bronze door whose two sides swung open. The bronze door was covered in all sorts of mysterious patterns. It had an indescribable heaviness and silence to it. With a creak, the door shook and cracked open a little. Behind the gap was endless darkness, as though it was the deepest and darkest night. Indescribable pairs of eyes were hidden in the darkness behind the door. They were densely packed and everywhere, but it was impossible to discern their actual bodies. Skinless arms covered in blood, along with greenish-black vines with baby faces reached out. Palms with mouths filled with teeth grabbed at everything beyond the door as they screamed, laughed, sobbed, yelled. This brought a terrifying suction force. Out of nowhere, cold hurricanes that sent chills down the bone stirred, pushing objects towards these strange creatures and the gap in the bronze door. The yellowish-green fog of poison was instantly cleared as Klein couldn't help but lean forward as he stumbled. The glove on his left palm immediately turned pitch black. It had the sinister feel of the night and the grandeur of the cosmos. Klein's brown eyes darkened as he spread out his left arm to the side in a gesture of politeness. The terrifying suction force that swept the bow's deck suddenly changed direction, grabbing the skeletons and rotting zombies that were rushing to the stern, and it threw them into the gap of the door. They were bound by the greenish-black, baby-faced vines and bloody arms and were pulled behind the bronze door where the countless eyes were. Distortion. Baron of Corruption's distortion. Klein had distorted the target of the mysterious door, and he used the skeletons and zombies on the Black Tulip to substitute himself. Despite that, he was still affected by the remnant forces of the tremendous suction force. He found it difficult to take a step, preventing him from fully making use of his nimble and agile traits. The cap he wore had already been blown up by the hurricane and was spinning in midair. It seemed to take flight as it pursued the undead creatures that had been sucked away. At this moment, Admiral Hell Ludwell, who wore his exaggerated triangular hat, raised his right hand again and extended his palm. The right side of his upper body rapidly turned illusory, as though it belonged to that of a specter or wraith. His arm kept extending and instantly covered quite a significant distance as his pale palm grabbed at his enemy. Whoosh! The noise from the hurricane suddenly vanished as soft sobbing sounds drilled into Klein's ears, causing his body to turn numb, as though his blood had frozen. As the pale palm approached, he seemed to be possessed by a wraith or evil spirit. He couldn't produce an effective response as he watched death approach. In despair, he felt his vitality deplete at an increasing rate. Without any resistance, Ludwell's pale and illusory right palm grabbed Klein and squashed him into a thin paper figurine. The paper figurine was covered with signs of dark green corrosion. Soon, it was shredded to dust under the hurricane that never stopped. To the side of the bronze door, Klein's figure surfaced again. His left glove had already been dyed with the color of pure sunlight. He immediately straightened his body and spread open his arms. Golden flames swirled around a pillar of holy light that descended from the sky, striking the bronze door which was covered in mysterious patterns. Sunlight suddenly burst out, and it was so blinding that it made it almost impossible for Klein to open his eyes. As for the terrifying door which Ludwell had created, it had begun shaking and turning slightly blurry. Even the extraordinary suction force from behind the door had weakened. More than half the greenish-black baby-faced vines and the bloody arms were vaporized. However, even more strange arms and distorted creatures attempted to squeeze out from the opening in the door. Just as Klein was about to continue using the Priest of Light's light of purification to purify the bronze door, Ludwell's pale palm swiped down wildly. Klein hurriedly dodged to the side as he kept rolling to avoid the remnant effects of the hurricane and the soul-sucking palm. 1 roll, 2 rolls, 3 rolls, and his body abruptly bounced up in a diagonal fashion. At some moment in time, creeping hunger had already appeared to be made of gold. Admiral Hell's silver mask was the first thing that was reflected in Klein's eyes. It included the pale flames in his eye sockets. Following that, 2 bolts of lightning brightened from the depths of his eyes. Interrogator's psychic piercing. At this moment, a black, square-shaped ring on Ludwell's left index finger produced a slight glow. Immediately a scene appeared in Klein's mind. It was a gigantic throne that was made up of the rotting heads of creatures like humans, elves, giants, dragons, demonic wolves, sea monsters, and vampires. On each side, there would be miniature transparent faces of wraiths, shadows, and evil spirits. They were filled with hatred, viciousness, and indignation. Suddenly, Klein felt as though his head had been struck by an axe. The fearsome pain filled his mind without any delay. His psychic piercing had not only failed to show its effects, but it had even ended up affecting him in an amplified manner. If not for him having experienced more extreme pain, Klein definitely would have fallen to the ground, wailing and struggling. But even so, he temporarily lost his ability to resist as he bent his back with a grimace. Seizing this opportunity, the gap where Ludwell's mouth was, a slow language that ordinary living creatures were unable to understand was emanated. The surroundings instantly turned dark, blurry, and illusory. This was the language of death that came from hell and the underworld. Just as Klein felt a little better, he discovered that his spirit body was floating up uncontrollably, separating from his body, inch by inch. And the terrifying suction force from the bronze door was an irresistible force to the spirit. No, this won't do. While his spirit body hadn't completely left his body, Klein raised his right arm and spread his hand which was wearing tinder with great difficulty. Different lustrous glows instantly interweaved as they surfaced before him and kept changing and rapidly flickered. Without any hesitation, Klein grabbed onto a pale white blob swirling with a gloomy green color. He twisted his wrist and extracted it. In this battle, the Beyonder power he wished to steal the most was the one that created the bronze door, but he couldn't guarantee his success. All he could do was seek the blessings of the goddess. The lustrous glow flew over and landed in tinder. However, this wasn't the Beyonder power that Klein wanted the most. However, it wasn't the worst either. The mouth behind Ludwell's silver mask moved, but it wasn't able to produce the sluggish, awkward language that was destined for the living to not understand. At the same time, Klein opened his mouth. One syllable after another of distorted, incomprehensible, jarring, and indecipherable words slowly spewed out of Klein's mouth. It made the hurricane produced by the bronze door's terrifying suction force to instantly calm down, cloaking the already dim surroundings with a deeper gloom. Only at this moment did he know that the Beyonder power which Admiral Hell Ludwell had just used was known as the language of the dead. It could circumvent the protection of one's flesh and blood, so as to target the spirit body. It belonged to an advancement in a spirit medium's powers. It could go from direct communication with spirits to that of commandeering, to the point of enslavement. Living creatures were unable to understand the resounding language. Ludwell couldn't help but freeze on the spot. A transparent layer rapidly surfaced on his pirate captain attire. His spirit was being tugged at by an illusory power. At this moment, the black, square-shaped ring on Ludwell's left index finger produced a faint glow. The minute portion of his spirit body which had been forcefully drawn out had returned to his body as the two fused back into one. Ding! With his right hand, Ludwell drew the thin rapier hanging by his waist. It was iron-black in color, and its tip gathered the surrounding light, turning into a dark point. Admiral Hell suddenly took a step forward and with vigorous wind currents, he suddenly closed the distance between him and Klein. Immediately, he thrust out the rapier in his hand at lightning speed. The bronze door which was covered with mysterious patterns remained standing erected in its original spot. It didn't vanish because of Ludwell's retracting of his left hand and subsequent actions. This was different from the similar-looking ability that Miss Sharon had previously cast using a mystical item. Oof! The black rapier pierced through Klein in an unavoidable manner. Klein's figure rapidly crumpled into a piece of paper. Its surface turned yellow and dry, as though it had been weathered for thousands of years. The hurricane brought about by the bronze door completely pulverized the paper figurine. In midair, Klein jumped out of the darkness as he held a huge handful of charms from the sea god domain. Storm! He quickly shouted in ancient Hermes as the tin flakes lit up individually as they sacrificed themselves to sea god. This also meant that if Klein wished so, he could recycle most of the materials and use it multiple times until the metals could no longer withstand the spirituality. Whoosh! Blue wind blades shot out as the surrounding waters sprayed out heavy waves that were as tall as the ship. As Klein didn't attempt or have the time to distinguish between the different kinds of charms, while these attacks inundated Ludwell, the extraordinary effects also augmented Admiral Hell. He was given augmented effects like underwater breathing, underwater mobility, flight, and pressure resistance, none of which were useful at that moment. Ludwell suddenly opened his mouth and produced a silent screech. He then struck the waves beside him as countless wind blades temporarily froze in midair. Immediately following that, Admiral Hell raised his left hand as the black, square-shaped ring on his index finger produced a sinister and eerie glow that instantly brightened. Whoosh! The bronze door, which exuded an indescribable feeling, instantly swelled as it doubled in height and width. Amidst a heavy creaking sound, the gap in the door opened up. The already terrifying suction force immediately rose to an unimaginable level. Blue wind blades and black sea waves were produced as Klein charged at the door from the air, heading straight for the strange vines and arms that extended outwards. Klein had planned on using the Priest of Light by clashing head-on with the bronze door with Light of Holiness to catch a breather, but he ended up seeing a glaring white fireball about half the height of a person fly over. The fireball's speed was augmented by the ridiculous suction forces generated by the door. It flew by Klein and smashed at the gap of the mysterious door. Boom! The white flames scattered as they rained down, but all it did was make the bronze door quake a little and dim a little. Klein took the opportunity and snapped his fingers. The few matchsticks he separated in his pockets immediately lit up as scarlet flames rapidly enveloped his body as he melted away. A flame burst out by the side of the bronze door as Klein leapt out of it. He instantly noticed that Anderson Hood was floating in midair in a rather awkward manner. He held a burning white spear in his palm. The strongest hunter had finally arrived, but he just appeared unaccustomed to flying. When Ludwell looked up and saw this scene, the pale white flames behind the silver mask clearly jumped twice. Clearly, he never expected that the future had two other powerhouses at the Pirate Admiral level apart from Admiral of Stars Catalya. Furthermore, they wielded pretty good mystical items and sealed artifacts. At this moment, Ludwell suddenly raised his hand and pressed down on his face, surprisingly taking off his silver mask. Heavy, pale white light suddenly spewed out from behind the mask, causing endless silence to instantly spread out from the black, square-shaped ring on Ludwell's left index finger. The silence surged into the bronze door and lifted it off the deck and into the air. The door covered in mysterious patterns fused with the endless silence as it rapidly burgeoned to more than 30 meters tall. With the sea as its base, it stood there, erect like an entrance to another world, one completely different from the present world. Creak. The bronze door opened as unspeakable darkness surged out and enveloped the Black Tulip's bow. Upon seeing this, Klein didn't focus on his attacks as he quickly took out the correct charm and rapidly used it on himself. A strong gust of wind swept over and lifted him above the Black Tulip. With the pull of the darkness, the gigantic sailboat steered into the bronze door, 10 meters a time, as it sailed into another world. Admiral Hel Ludwell stood at the bow as he looked up into the sky. His face was blanketed by the pale white luster, preventing anyone from discerning his looks. His gaze first swept past Klein before landing on Anderson Hood. He seemed to make a mental note of these two hunters, but he didn't make any further attempts to attack. He seemed to have been restrained by the surrounding darkness. Anderson was taken aback as he didn't hesitate to throw out the burning white spear in his hand. The spear shot straight at Ludwell, but once it entered the region enclosed by darkness and silence, it silently vanished. Ludwell is planning to escape? How decisive! Klein was first stunned before he recalled that Azek's copper whistle was still on the Black Tulip. With the gigantic sailboat halfway inside the bronze door and about to enter another world with no way to stop them, Klein threw a matchstick and snapped his fingers. He appeared 50 meters above the stern where the undead creatures were fighting for Azek's copper whistle. This item, which kept changing hands, finally burst into a scarlet flame due to the matchsticks tied to it. Amidst the flames, Klein's figure surfaced there and grabbed Azek's copper whistle. This was the preparations that he had made for retrieving the copper whistle. Furthermore, to prevent any mishaps from happening, such as the matchsticks being pulled away by the undead creatures, he had also coated the copper whistle with an easily flammable essential oil of the sun. Paw! Surrounded by countless undead, Klein didn't have the luxury of time to retract his hand that grabbed the copper whistle. He immediately snapped his fingers again. At this moment, transparent, rotting, pale, or illusory hands grabbed him. The matchstick Klein had previously thrown into the air ignited in midair as it produced a flame. His figure quickly materialized amidst the flames. His face was livid and his lips were white. Having been grabbed by countless shadows, wraiths, and undead creatures, Klein felt that the depths of his spirit body was ice cold. He couldn't control his body as he plummeted into the sea dyed in gold. With the Black Tulip almost completely crossing the bronze door, the sea, which appeared like an entrance to hell, had been restored to normal. Klein sank a few meters and swallowed a few mouthfuls of bitter and astringent seawater before he ultimately recovered. Thankfully, I was sufficiently prepared. As this thought flashed past his mind, he suddenly felt something amiss. By wearing the Murloc cufflink, he had the passive ability to breathe underwater for 10 minutes. He shouldn't have drank mouthfuls of water. Klein suddenly turned his head and looked at his wrist, only to realize that the blue cufflink had detached itself at some point in time. It's lost. Tinder lost it. I was on the Black Tulip the entire time. Klein splashed a few times and floated to the surface, just in time to see the gigantic sailboat's tail meld into the darkness as the bronze door slowly closed. He instinctively swam forward a few seconds before ultimately stopping. He selected one of his remaining charms and gave himself the Beyonder effect of underwater breathing. In midair, Anderson Hood clicked his tongue when he saw this. This fellow is really crazy. He's actually trying to engage in pursuit. At this moment, the starlight above the future fell and condensed into a long bridge that extended over. Catalya had finally finished off the grayish-black monster with immense vitality. What a pity. If only Admiral Hel had hesitated a little and didn't flee in such a timely fashion. Anderson Hood sighed silently and firmly landed on the star bridge. As he watched Gehrman Sparrow fly over, he was just about to greet and praise him when he saw the cold and gloomy expression. Anderson instinctively made way and chuckled dryly, allowing Gehrman Sparrow to walk past him. After returning to the future via the star bridge, Klein held back his effusing emotions and watched Frank Lee walk over and give him a thumbs up. You're the craziest fellow I've ever met. You actually dared to board the Black Tulip alone and single-handedly challenge Admiral Hell. You even returned alive. Sorry, in terms of craziness, I'm far inferior to you, Klein thought in response. At this moment, pirates with long or disheveled hair expressed their astonishment and amazement. In such an atmosphere, Klein closed his eyes and felt his faceless potion completely digest.